Frank Miller graduated from university, and everywhere there are shouts and congratulations, because his studies are behind him, and very soon he will be able to become a prosecutor. The main character was standing in the company of his classmates and suddenly heard a familiar voice shouting his name. He turned around and saw his parents, who had come to the graduation to congratulate him on completing one of the most important stages in his life. Frank was angry, his veins were bulging with anger. His relationship with his parents was complicated, so the main character did not want them to come. Frank's parents couldn't understand how they could miss their only son's graduation. His mother tried to cheer Frank up, offered to spend time together, buy him whatever he wanted in honor of his graduation. A conversation about the future began. The parents suggested that their son return to music again and play the violin because he was doing so well. The main character was angry. He believed that thanks to the violin, he would not become rich and successful, and he wanted to decide for himself how to live. The father was furious at his son's behavior. He was once again convinced that Frank did not respect him and did not consider him an authority. The Miller family owned a small laundromat in town and were poor enough that Frank was tired of the same old food and the stench of dry cleaning. The main character had no friends. His strongest friendship was with cramming. He studied to the point of exhaustion in order to change his life. He didn't want to limit his life to the tiny room in the laundry shop his parents ran. Everyone he knew talked about graduation as if it was the final test. But for Frank, it was just the first step into a new life filled with light. Weeks have passed. No one still believes in him. He doesn't even expect support from his family anymore. He wants to achieve everything himself. People call him unworthy of success behind his back and secretly envy him because now he performs better than others in interviews. Frank set his sights on a scholarship from Jahan Holding, the main company in South Korea's business world. Among the people, the Jahan Holding scholarship holder was considered a joke, becoming a loyal dog for the company, but our hero didn't care. Frank thought only about the success this company would bring him. He wanted to change his life. For him, working in a prestigious company was a guarantee of stability and a comfortable life. Hard work, responsibility, and total dedication to the company made Frank the chief prosecutor of the Western District. Decades later, he had achieved everything he dreamed of at his graduation. But instead of defending the law and justice, he defended the company. But Frank was tormented by his conscience. He did not understand whether he was on the right path, where success ended and when his life would finally sparkle with new colors. One of the company's managers suggested sending the main character into politics, since he was showing worthy results. Frank was shocked. He did not want to get involved in politics, but Jahan Holding had financial difficulties that could be improved by such a development. Frank didn't see how his poor background could help, but his senior colleague already had a plan to make things work. The head of the company had a daughter, whom he also wanted to get involved in politics, and he believed that an alliance with Frank would play into the hands of both his family and the entire company. The main character was promised success that he could not even dream of. He thought about the offer and accepted it. After some time, Frank needed to undergo a medical examination, and he went to the clinic, where he heard unexpected and sad news. At the appointment, the doctor told our hero that he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He brought himself to this state. The symptoms are not noticeable in the early stages, but if Frank had attended medical examinations, the cancer could have been detected much earlier. The main character began to blame himself for neglecting his health while building a career, but now he just has to pull himself together and mentally prepare for chemotherapy. While waiting for the train, Frank thought about whose words he could find support in, who he could tell about his misfortune. A rich, unloved wife, a father-in-law who considered him a dog that was taken in by Jahan Holding, a boss who would immediately fire him upon learning of his illness. He could not find support in any of them. Suddenly, the phone in his hand rang. It was his mother. She seemed to sense that her son needed her now. He answered the phone. His mother started asking how he was doing, and from Frank's voice, she immediately understood that something had happened. The protagonist had tears in his eyes. He could not gather the strength to confess to his mother that he was sick. Looking around at the smiles of passers-by, he began to remember what he had spent his life on and what was good in it. And yet there were moments of happiness in Frank's life and things that were more important than success and money. At the same time, a man suddenly falls next to our hero right onto the rails under the train. Frank immediately rushes to help the fallen boy. His phone flies to the side and his mother's screams from the smartphone can be heard in the distance. The main character walked down from the platform onto the rails, not paying attention to what was happening around him. He was only concerned about the life of another guy. He sat down on the railroad tracks near the guy to check his pulse and see if he was conscious. Frank realized that the man next to him was unconscious and not responding to either his words or actions. At the moment when our hero began to lift the fallen guy onto his shoulders, a light from a train rushing towards them flashed in front of them. At that moment, he rethought his life. He had to tell his father-in-law that politics did not interest him. He should not clean up other people's dirty deeds. He had to live confidently and according to his conscience. Frank regretted the life he had lived, and if he had the opportunity to go back in time, he would not have wasted his life like that. Being on the verge of death, the main character heard a melody, a symphony, and thought that people do hear music before death. In his last moment, he saw a white deer descending from the sky and a bright light that blinded him. Frank didn't know where he was, but he could smell the oil, the smell from his childhood that he inhaled every day in the laundry room. The hero was mired in memories. So many years had passed, and he still could not forget this smell. But no matter how much he hated it as a child, now he misses it. He wanted to meet his parents at least once before his death, who had doted on him all their lives, but he did not notice it. As soon as he realized that he would not see his parents again, he immediately began to appreciate all the evenings and meetings together and regretted that he did not even take a photo with them at his graduation. Suddenly, his mother's voice was heard. Waking him up, she insisted that he get up right away, otherwise he would be late for school. Frank opened his eyes and found himself in the tiny room off his parents' laundry room where he had spent his entire childhood. In front of him stood his mother, whom he already looked at with different eyes. He was scared, but very happy. She said that she had been waking him up for a long time, but he still couldn't wake up and she was very scared. Our hero still couldn't believe what he was seeing. Just a minute ago, he was in another world and time. And now he was lying in his bed and his mother was waking him up in the morning, just like in childhood. The desire to enjoy life awoke in him. He was full of strength and energy. He immediately got out of bed and got ready for school. His parents were shocked by what they saw. He had never been so cheerful before. His mother was wary because he was again sitting over his textbooks until the morning. But Frank, smiling on the street, reassured her and said that everything was fine. He said goodbye to his parents, promised that he would return soon, and satisfied, headed toward school. The father couldn't believe his eyes. His son was so smiling and open. He hadn't remembered him like this for a long time. The father asked his wife what she had put in her son's food that had caused Frank to start behaving like an adult without the teenage resentments and secrecy. But she didn't react in any way. She was just happy. As the days went by, Frank realized that he had gone back in time to high school, when he was just beginning to think about his future and career. After his own death, full of regrets, he found himself in the time he missed most. This is his chance to fill his life with light, and he will not miss it for anything because he was given a second life. One school day, the whole class was writing a test, which Frank passed with flying colors, which was hard to believe, because before he had written all the tests with zeros. One of his classmates was sure that our hero had cheated on this test. He was even ready to bet money with him, but their argument was abruptly interrupted. An angry teacher came into the classroom and told Frank that he was being called to the teacher's room for a serious talk, which made the main character very nervous. There was an enraged woman standing in the teacher's room. She was shaking with anger and immediately began shouting at our hero. Frank's class teacher was next to them, trying to calm the woman down and standing up for his student. The woman was indignant at how the last student in the class could write the test better than everyone else, and accused him of cheating, since his parents do not have money to pay tutors, thereby insulting his family. The class teacher asked her to respect the boundaries, to which she began asking him if he knew who she was and how much she had done in the parents' committee. She said she raised money to clean up the environment and even helped her students go on a field trip abroad. It turned out that her daughter had always been first on the list of the best, and she was offended that some poor boy had cheated and wouldn't admit it. Frank was holding back with all his might from starting an argument with this woman, but her words were driving him crazy, and in the end, he held back. He, like a real prosecutor, recited the contents of the articles of the criminal code by heart, said that she was taking advantage of her position as president of the parents' committee, but was not doing anything really. The other teachers began to listen attentively to the argument, in which Frank began to list incidents of bribery among the teachers. Everyone around him understood that he was right. Frank was pleased with himself and decided to ask again if she really thought he had cheated. The woman didn't know what other arguments to make other than to press him on his disrespectful attitude towards adults. The class teacher intervened in the argument and said that without evidence, no one could be accused of anything and sent Frank back to class. Finally, the main character told the woman to be more careful in her accusations and statements in the future. Walking down the hallway back to class, Frank thought about what a walking problem he was. but was glad that things could get better in this situation. Suddenly, his gaze fell on the notice board that stood in the center of the corridor. He decided to come closer and take a look. Among the announcements was a poster for a classical music club that was recruiting new students. He remembered that a friend had told him about this group and invited him to join, because it was no secret that Frank had previously enjoyed playing the violin. He really liked playing the violin. At home, he constantly listens to classical music. It calms him down. As a child, he would organize concerts for his parents. They would gather in a room. He would stand in the center and merge with the music. Walking further, Frank heard a familiar melody coming from the office at the end of the corridor. He remembered that it was the song that had been played just before his death that had momentarily transported his thoughts back to that day. He was under the spell of Beethoven's symphony and did not notice how he opened the door to this office. He was not the only one who was surprised when he found himself at a lesson of that same classical music club. The students and the teacher did not expect that someone would disturb them in the middle of the lesson. Frank apologized for interrupting their lesson and said that he himself did not understand how he got there. He simply followed the call of the music. The teacher assumed that since he was drawn to music, it meant he had a good ear and asked our hero to introduce himself. James immediately shouted out Frank's name and was very glad that his friend had decided to come to their circle. James had told his teacher about Frank before, and she was pleased that the first-year student who had done best in his exam was interested in music. The teacher's name is Emily Wilson. She teaches music in the 2nd and 3rd years, and she suggested that I join their club. Our hero was confused and said that he didn't want to join yet. Amelia suggested that he stay in the office and look around. James said that a couple of minutes before Frank arrived, the teacher said that she would play something for the class on the same violin that the main character himself used to play. Emily Wilson was interested in the new fact about the arriving student, but Frank was shy and said that he had been a little interested in the violin as a child. The teacher drew his attention to the fact that it is important to be able to play, but it is also necessary to be able to listen. Amelia was sure that Frank had a talent for listening that he didn't even know he had. The teacher began to play the violin and asked the students to listen carefully and then share their impressions. Frank was delighted from the first seconds. Amelia captivated him with her violin playing. He could not take his eyes off her. The melody began cautiously, as if walking on frozen ground, and continued at an allegro tempo, the bow seeming to pierce the crumbling ice cover. Amelia's fingers seemed to dance as if they were desperately trying to fight the cold wind. Suddenly, the melody changed. The bow's movement across the strings continued unabated. Frank was delighted with her violin playing. In his past life, he had frequent contact with orchestral and concert classics because he was educated in the upper classes. So Frank could clearly distinguish all her skills and realize that she was not an ordinary music teacher. Our character knew the piece that the teacher performed, so she was surprised and immediately realized that he was passionate about the classics. Frank said her violin playing was superb. He was really pleasantly surprised. But he also noticed that her right hand had been injured at some point and had not fully recovered, and he decided to ask her directly about it. Emily Wilson was both tense and upset, believing that the injury had long since left no trace on her performance. The protagonist began to explain that she tenses her index finger when she takes the bow. This is especially noticeable during changes of melody. Frank experiences this for the first time in his life. Now the melody itself seems to come alive before his eyes. Amelia was suddenly overwhelmed with memories after the words of the student who had just arrived in the classroom. She dreamed of becoming a violinist, but now her dream burst like a soap bubble in an instant. She didn't understand how it was possible to see through her habit, which remained after rehabilitation, in just one performance. The teacher thought it was an impossible task for ordinary people, unless Frank was like Paganini, an unrivaled genius. In the evenings, the Miller family often spent time together in the living room watching television. One of the channels reported on the achievements of the Jaehan Holding Company, thanks to which the Republic of Korea became the leader of the global semiconductor industry. Frank thought back to the business he had done for this company in his past life, and he couldn't believe that the company had succeeded with such a leader. Our hero's father admired the results of Jahan Holding, but he simply did not know what his son knew about it. At that moment, his mother came into the room with a watermelon and began asking her son about his plans for the holidays. Frank was going to help his parents in the laundry during the holidays. His mother suggested that he go to his grandfather. According to her, he really wanted to see his grandson. Our main character was in a stupor. In his past life, he was practically not with him and survived his death. At that time, he was so immersed in his studies that he hardly even attended the funeral. The parents insisted that their son go, relax with his grandfather, and see the city. Frank decided for himself that a life full of regrets had passed and he would not repeat those mistakes. A few days later, he was already walking to the bus and wondering in his mind what had happened that his grandfather suddenly wanted to see him. His mother's father had severed ties with her many years ago and had little contact with the Miller family. With mixed feelings, Frank took his seat on the bus and headed into town, unsure of what else might happen in his new life. The main character got from the bus station by taxi and was dropped off on a beautiful wide street next to a large house. As expected, it was not a house, but some kind of castle. Although he knew that his mother's parents were rich, he did not imagine that they were that rich. His grandfather, Carl White, was the founder of one of the best companies in the South Korean chemical industry. When Frank's mother married his father, a man from a common family, she was thrown out of the house and cut off from all ties. Eventually, the company passed to her brother, the protagonist's uncle, who had absolutely no talent for management, which is why the company went bankrupt. In his past life, his grandfather didn't even try to look for his grandson, so Frank was worried standing at the gate. He saw his relatives only a couple of times in his childhood. The maid opened the gate and greeted the guest with a smile, asking how he felt after the journey. She told Frank that the whole family was gathering at her grandfather's house today, and he was very excited to hear the news. The maid led Frank into the living room and introduced him to the others. All the guests immediately tensed up. No one was happy about this meeting. His relatives decided that our hero's mother sent him here to impress his grandfather, and they despised her for it. Frank explained with an awkward smile on his face that no one had sent him. His grandfather had invited him himself. The uncle was seething with rage. He accused his nephew of lying and his mother of hypocrisy. He did not believe that Carl White could have invited him himself. Suddenly, there was the sound of a cane on the floor, and the elder White entered the living room, informing everyone that it was he who had called Frank here. Everyone around instantly changed their expression. Their intonations and tone of voice became softer and quieter. The grandfather asked his grandson how his mother was doing and was very friendly. Our hero's uncle intervened in their conversation and began asking his father why he suddenly invited Frank here, since they had business that should be discussed without prying ears. The main character decided that his uncle was afraid that he might take his place. He decided to settle the situation and suggested retiring to his cousin's room, since they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Our hero considered his mother's brother to be so rotten inside that he could smell the stench from 3 miles away. He decided that for now, it was better to avoid his uncle and pretend that he knew nothing. There was no point in smearing himself with this dirt. As Frank approached the room with his relatives, he was worried. He realized that his sisters and brothers were just as rotten and spoiled. Entering the room, he saw the dissatisfied faces of his relatives, who looked at him with a contemptuous gaze. But Frank decided to diffuse the situation with his smile and greeted everyone. Bill didn't greet his brother in the best way. He immediately pounced on Frank with questions about what he was doing there. In a past life, Bill tarnished his grandfather's company's name with fraud and illegal financial dealings, and tearfully begged Frank to help him. In the end, the cousin turned into a pathetic and frightened curmudgeon. Bill began to act very aggressively towards our hero, insulting his mother and pointing out the poverty of his family. The other brothers and 2 sisters echoed Bill and laughed at his evil and offensive jokes. Frank realized that if he didn't stand up for himself now, they would continue to look down on him. He decided it was time to take action and show his entire family that he was not a punching bag. Our hero told his brother not to get cocky, after which a fight broke out between the boys. Bill grabbed Frank by the shirt and, telling him that he would quickly put him in his place, hit him. But there is a quick way to deal with such arrogant degenerates who have nothing to their name except their parents' money. Frank responded to his brother's blow by kicking him in the stomach so hard that Bill flew across the room. But even sitting on his knees and whining in pain, Bill continued to shout nasty things. Frank picked Bill up from the floor by his shirt and pulled him towards him. They looked into each other's eyes with hatred. But Bill could say nothing except ask others for help. He was powerless. Frank only wanted to teach his cousin a lesson and warned him that if he didn't stop being arrogant, it wouldn't end with one blow. In the afternoon, the whole family gathered for lunch. The adults sat at one table, the children at another. Frank's mother cooked her father some crab, one of his favorite foods, and gave it to her son to share with his grandfather. Carl was very surprised and began to eat the dish. He was delighted with how wonderfully the crab was marinated. Carl's other children were very tense. None of them had ever cooked for him. Our hero could not even imagine that his mother's cooking would create such a situation. His uncle and aunt became noticeably nervous. The sister who disappeared from their lives suddenly comes back into play. But Grandpa still wouldn't have made Frank's mother his successor. He doesn't have that kind of character. Suddenly, Carl's eldest son decided to start the topic of how his father should retire and relax, and spend time with his grandchildren. Frank's grandfather decided to test his children and asked them to recite by heart the steps involved in making his company's detergent. His eldest son hesitated. No one present could find a suitable answer to his father's question. Carl was angered by their silence. He understood that none of them would become good managers since they did not know what their own company was doing. He realized that they simply wanted to take his place, to which his children immediately began to justify themselves by saying that this was not what they meant. Grandfather stood up from the table, leaving the room with a request that everyone think about what it was like to be a simple hired worker all their life. Even the children became nervous, realizing the situation of their parents. Only Frank sat calmly with a smile on his face. He was amused by this situation. Carl said his company, White Chemical, would remain in the hands of those with the talent to do so. He dedicated his whole life to the company, and if his brainchild remains in the hands of one of them, then even after death he will never find peace. Frank realized that his grandfather was determined and would carefully approach the choice of his successor. But in his past life, his relatives still managed to ruin the company. So what will change this time? After lunch, Grandpa was reading the news in the newspaper, and Frank was sitting opposite him in the chair. A conversation started between them. While I am here resting in my chair from fruitful work, I want to ask you, dear YouTube viewer, how do you like this story? It is fresh, like my mind in the morning. Share your impressions in the comments under this video. Have a wonderful day. Grandfather asked what our hero wanted to do when he grew up. It was an unexpected and exciting question for him. Frank rethought his values in this life and replied that he wanted to make his mom and dad happy. Carl liked his answer. His grandson turned out to be an exemplary son and asked Frank if he wanted to earn a lot of money to realize his goal. Knowledge from a past life would easily enrich our hero. But now he is not very concerned about finances. He wants to live a life that he himself would consider happy. He told his grandfather that wealth did not always guarantee happiness, and Carl realized that Frank had matured a lot since the last time he saw him. A maid entered the living room, took Frank's things to his room, and invited him to go and look around. Finally, the grandfather told the main character that they were going to dinner together that evening. Carl's friend really wants to see his grandson. Frank felt nervous before entering his room. He slowly turned the door handle. He realized that his mother had lived here. She used to have a wonderful room, and now she was raising a child, washing other people's clothes and still not complaining about the difficulties. Near the desk on the right side, he saw a violin standing, which so attracted him. He noticed that the violin was still being looked after, and it dawned on him that his mother was happy when he started playing because she also played the violin. Frank opened the case and touched the violin with his fingertips, but this wonderful moment was interrupted. A maid entered the room and offered him to try on the clothes that his grandfather had prepared for him. An hour later, our hero was riding in the car. His grandfather was telling him about his friend and how their conversations constantly turned into a competition over who had the best grandchildren. Carl White said that today they would put an end to these disputes, and Frank at this time was at a loss to guess who they were going to visit. At the same time, the streets they were driving along were so familiar to him, as if he had been there before. And so they arrived. After sitting in the car for a while and collecting their thoughts, the grandfather and his grandson got out. Frank looked around and remembered that he had been in this place before. By that time, the house was already abandoned, but at this time, it still had an owner. A man approached them from the other side of the house, joking that they were walking around here without his permission. Frank turned around and was speechless. He could not imagine that they had come to visit him. Grandfather's friend said kindly that he was glad to meet the very grandson that Carl White was proud of. It turned out that Grandpa's friend all this time was Chairman John of Jahan Holding. Frank, still in shock, barely managed to say his name. He was so unprepared for this meeting. John Smith told Frank to call him grandfather instead of sir, which was unexpected but very nice, so he happily agreed. Sitting in the dining room over a cup of tea, he was immersed in memories of his past work and the role that the owner of this house played in it. Chairman John Smith was a man of incredible vision who started the history of Jahan Holding. In the ruins of Seoul, in the very center, he opened a small trading company, which later turned into the best corporation in South Korea. When Frank became a Jahan Holding scholar, Mr. Smith had already retired, but he never thought that they would meet like this. John began to question Carl about how long he was going to cling to the chemical industry. He felt sorry that he was wasting his management skills on just this. John noted that South Korea was increasingly looking to overseas markets, but their conversation was interrupted. Jessica, John Smith's favorite granddaughter, entered the room and he introduced her to his guests. Frank couldn't believe his eyes. he realized who the granddaughter of the founder of Jahan Holding was. Jessica, later nicknamed the Ice Queen Jessica Smith by the group, was a seemingly sweet and friendly girl. She offered to give Frank a tour of the house and show him her favorite room. In their past life, they hardly saw each other when our hero worked for Jahan, but he knew about her reputation. Jessica was the chairman's granddaughter, who inherited his character and talents. She was smart and strict. Everyone loved her and at the same time feared her because of her influence in the company. She was the cold and meticulous head of product department Jahan, the Ice Queen Jessica Smith. While Frank's thoughts were somewhere in the past, he didn't notice how they reached little Jessica's room. For the 90s, her room was simply luxurious. She asked him how he became the first in his village school, having prepared a sharp answer to her own question in advance. She said that it was easy to be first in his school, because few people study in the villages. Jessica self-importantly told him that she was already following the high school curriculum and pointed out that the kids from the village couldn't do that. She asked Frank if he could solve some of her problems, confident that he was doomed to fail, but Frank accepted the challenge with a grin on his face. Jessica was beside herself. He solved all the problems absolutely correctly in 10 minutes, while she solved them for an entire hour. Frank sat opposite her, pleased, of course. An 11-year-old child couldn't handle this. However, after the exam at the law school, such problems were a piece of cake for him, so it was not difficult for him to solve everything quickly and correctly. Even the great and mighty Jessica Smith is still just a child and doesn't look like the Ice Queen at all. And suddenly, the main character noticed a violin case in the corner and decided to ask if Jessica could play it. She was glad that now she had the opportunity to prove to herself and Frank that she was better than him in some way. He asked her to play, and without thinking twice, she took the violin out of its case and began to move the bow across the strings. She played the same song that their teacher had played for them in classical music class, a piece by Vivaldi. It was hard to believe this coincidence, but the most important thing is that she is good at it. It is difficult to do something like this at 11 years old. Although her fingers are still too short and the melody is lagging, her excellent sense of rhythm makes up for all the shortcomings. After finishing, Jessica asked Frank how he liked her playing. He replied that she played very well. But something about her playing bothered him and he dared to say so, suggesting that she choose another song to study. She was very upset and was tormented by the question of why she should choose another song if she had never made a mistake. Frank didn't know how to explain that if you practice two complicated pieces for a long time, the body can learn and get used to them incorrectly. And then Jessica realized that he himself could play the violin. Otherwise, how could he come up with such conclusions about the songs that were suitable for her? She was eager to hear him play and immediately grabbed the violin and handed it to him, forcing him to play something for her. As soon as he touched the violin with his hand, Frank was overcome by a strange feeling. His heart began to beat wildly. He had only vague memories of learning to play, but the instrument seemed to speak to him. Suddenly, he saw the image of a white deer, which he first met on the verge of death, and he told him to play the violin. Frank, without realizing it, was already confidently playing the instrument, and in his head, the voice of the deer told him that he would succeed. That evening, after Carl White and his grandson had left, a violin teacher came to the Smith family home. Jessica, without even having time to say hello, took the teacher by the hand and led her to her room. She took a notebook of notes from the table and handed it to her music teacher, warning him that she had a request. At this time, Frank and his grandfather were returning home. Carl asked his grandson what impressions he had from meeting John. The main character said that John Smith had a wise look. Then the grandfather asked what kind of look he had in his grandson's opinion. In the end, Carl White couldn't get rid of his untalented children and his company went bankrupt. So Frank said he had a warm look. After a couple of minutes of silence, Grandpa said he heard the sound of a violin coming from Jessica's room. He became a little embarrassed and replied that Jessica had let him listen to her play, and he began to remember his feelings during his own playing. He had been playing for so long, at that age it was difficult to even maintain the correct posture, not to mention knowing the notes. But when he holds the violin, his body moves by itself. At the moment when the bow barely touched the strings, it was as if he became a bird flying right over the icy surface. He associated it with the fact that a careful flapping of wings instantly turns into a run. And when a frost storm howls and the whole earth is covered with a blanket of ice, the melody changes so smoothly, like someone singing. Frank didn't know what happened then, but he still couldn't stop his heart from pounding and shaking. Grandpa decided to break the silence and asked Frank if his grandson knew what his company did. The main character replied that he had a company that produced chemicals, and his uncle told him that Carl was the chairman of White Chemical. Then the grandfather asked what the chemical industry was. The company started its journey as a soap factory and now produces various chemicals from washing powders to fertilizers. This industry has a great future. Frank replied that the chemical industry would help people build the industry of the future. The grandfather clearly did not expect such an answer from his 11-year-old grandson. He was surprised and did not even know how to react. At that very moment, the driver informed them that they had arrived at the house, and the grandfather got out of the car first. Carl White told his grandson that they had dinner planned any day now, but if it had been an ordinary dinner, he would not have mentioned it. Grandfather added that Chairman Smith was organizing a meeting, and not only his acquaintances would be there, but also Frank's peers. In the 90s, when the ties between the founders of the companies were still close, friendly meetings were held between the owners of the first corporations. At such meetings, one could make useful acquaintances in order to jointly support the selfish interests of the ruling class to which they belonged. The old meetings later became of no use when power passed into the hands of the second generation. Frank only knew about this because he was always cleaning up after Jahan Holding. But in reality, these meetings with ordinary people had nothing in common. It was only their world. The main thing in all this was that only the recognized heirs could take part in these meetings. And then it dawned on Frank. He thought that his grandfather was trying to make him his replacement, and if that was the case, then his place in this world was already determined. The main character decided for himself that he would not let the things that his grandfather built fall apart so easily. Frank had felt a lot of different emotions today, and he had a lot to think about before going to bed. And all this time, music lessons continued in John Smith's house. Jessica forced her teacher to play again and again. She asked the teacher to play a piece by Vivaldi, although the teacher would never have taught this song at such an early age. She understood that in this house she was well paid for her music lessons, and the girl was smart, but it was difficult to cope with her stubbornness. The teacher played without mistakes. But for Jessica, it was not the same, because Frank's performance really did make the room feel like winter was coming. She shared her thoughts with the teacher, who was surprised and asked who Frank was, because Jessica had not talked about him before. The next day, Grandpa, Frank, and Bill met for breakfast in the dining room. Frank asked Grandpa how he slept. He sat down next to Bill at the table, smiled at him and said, "Hello, our hero's cousin didn't know how to behave after the last meeting." Since that day, Bill doesn't even dare look him in the eye. How could he have committed fraud in his past life if he doesn't have the guts? A minute later, Carla's eldest daughter came into the dining room and happily announced to everyone that she had prepared stewed ribs. But Grandpa didn't want ribs. He understood why she was doing all this. His daughter had never been interested in cooking in her life. He asked for the crab that Frank's mother had cooked. She got angry, but quickly calmed down, and then asked her father who he would go to the banquet with this time. Carl White was visibly hurt by her behavior and words, and replied that it was none of her business who he went to the gala dinner with. Frank's aunt had let it slip that the future heirs were being invited to this meeting, and, as expected, the relatives had plans for it. She suggested that Carl go there with Bill, her son, since the other children were still too young for such evenings. Grandpa was furious. He asked if she even understood what place she was talking about and why the hell she was suggesting that he go with Bill. Both Carl's daughter and her son were scared. She began to justify herself by saying that this was a good opportunity, but her grandfather did not let her finish. He said he wouldn't just take her son with him and called them stupid and greedy. Here he glanced at the main character and began to recall his thoughts about the future of the chemical industry, which resonated with him then. And suddenly, Carl White, unexpectedly for everyone present at the table, announced that Frank would be going to this banquet with him. An hour later, right after breakfast, Frank was already in a car with a driver to choose a suit for the evening. He looked around, examined the streets, and suddenly saw familiar places. A crowd of young people and tall buildings. Frank realized that outside the car window was his college town, which brought back memories. Suddenly, the car braked sharply. The main character hit the front seat and did not understand what happened. The driver was scared that he had hit the road hard and asked if he was okay. Frank replied that he was fine and asked what happened. The driver explained that a car ahead had braked sharply and he was going to go around it and continue on their way. Our hero saw a foreigner and assumed that most likely he and the taxi driver could not understand each other. Frank asked the driver to wait and got out of the car. In front of him, he saw a well-groomed, stylishly dressed man who clearly did not understand English. The dialogue between them then continues in Italian. Frank asks if he can help with anything and ultimately decides to give the foreigner a ride. It turned out that the Italian needed to go to the hotel, but the driver misunderstood and took him to the park, and on top of all this, the man also lost his wallet. Frank asked the foreigner for what purpose he had come here, as a tourist or not, and during the conversation he realized that he had a business meeting here. The man wanted to see the local sights, so he arrived a week before the appointed day, which is why he got lost. He told Frank that it was wonderful to make friends all over the world, and that casual acquaintances sometimes turned into special connections. A few minutes later, they arrived at the hotel. The foreigner was glad that he met our hero and believed that their meeting was not accidental either. The man wanted to give his young friend a business card, but he didn't have a wallet, so he introduced himself and extended his hand to Frank. His name is Lorenzo Conte. He said that if the main character suddenly needs help, he can come to this hotel and contact him. After this, when Frank returned home, his driver went to his grandfather's office and said that his grandson knew Italian. The driver added that Frank knows Italian not just at a school level, he speaks it completely fluently. Grandfather was surprised and let the driver go, but he thought about it. In his younger years, white chemical was his main pride, and before he thought that his eldest son should inherit it. But then Frank's mother, his youngest daughter, was born, and she was always a sensible and sincere girl, so he began to change his views. But because of other people's prejudices, Carl began to doubt more and more, and perhaps now he regrets it. His grandson's words came to his mind that he wanted to make his mom and dad happy, and the chemical industry would help people build the industry of the future. Every time Carl looks at Frank and sees how smart he is and how much he resembles his mother, he misses his daughter. After dinner, Carl White and his grandson were sitting in the living room talking. He asked if Frank remembered about today's dinner. The banquet, to which the founders and heirs of the corporations were invited, was not only a luxurious social event, but also an opportunity to show the world their hand-picked successors. Grandpa added that they would need to stop by his work before the meeting, so Frank should start getting ready. He was so surprised that his grandfather was hiring him to work for him that he even spilled soda on himself from such an unexpected offer. Carl remembered his words about chemistry becoming the engine of progress and decided to organize a tour of the company for his grandson. The plant was very large, there was huge equipment on the site, and everything looked fascinating. The grandfather saw the delight in his grandson's eyes and was pleased. He asked if Frank liked the plant and what he thought of it. Frank looked at every detail and realized that the white chemical plant was in no way inferior to the subsidiaries of the largest corporations. Carl White began building another plant to produce electronic materials. But in his past life, his relatives sold everything after his death. As they approached the office building, Frank and his grandfather were met by white chemical employees who bowed to Carl with deep respect. Among the staff was the protagonist's uncle, whose face showed that he was not happy to see his nephew there. Frank thought it would be ridiculous for his uncle to try to interfere with his grandfather's plans, and Carl asked him what would happen to the chemical industry in the future. His son thinks the plant should focus on high-value-added industries, such as building a plant to produce display materials. Carl White asked what would need to be done to produce such goods, and was told that talented people needed to be selected. Frank was shocked that the CEO answered such nonsense. This is far from a strategic plan for the development of the enterprise. Unlike other industries, the chemical industry is laying the foundation for new industries of the future, and the development of existing specialists is a priority. Therefore, these words of the uncle show how ignorant he is of what he himself is doing. The grandfather told his son that he never ceased to disappoint him with his answers and advice. Carl called his grandson to go further. Frank, looking back at his uncle, thought that this is what he deserved. He noticed the man standing behind his uncle. He looked suspiciously familiar. Walking down the alley to the office, the grandfather asked our hero what he thought it meant to be a leader. Frank responded by asking if the point of business wasn't to keep everyone fed and provided for. He said that he believed it was true that excess was worse than deficiency, and Carl praised him. He believed that his grandson would grow up to be a good man. Grandpa couldn't believe how Frank managed to say such wonderful things every time. The main character is content with one life consumed by money and power. Now he is not at all greedy for a career. And finally, they reached Carl White's office. Frank walked in and couldn't believe his eyes. The office fascinated him. He walked around and looked at every detail. And suddenly his eye fell on a chest of drawers with framed photographs, and he stopped to look at them. He saw a photograph of his mother in her youth, holding a violin and smiling. And at that moment, he realized how much his grandfather missed her. At the same time, his grandfather called him and asked if he had ever seen a gramophone. Frank immediately rushed to him and began asking his grandfather to listen to something, at least one song, and he happily agreed. Grandfather took out a worn record. It was immediately obvious that it had been played often before, and Beethoven's Spring Sonata began to play. The fresh, almost sweet melody tickled the ear. The violin and piano created a wonderful harmony. This composition can be compared to flower petals dancing in a light spring breeze, but this was not the performance of a professional. It's hard for the general public to hear this in a fairly accomplished performance. The cover of the record does not indicate the artist or the title, but it was also very worn. Frank realized that the person whose playing was recorded on the record was his mother and asked his grandfather about it. Carl White was confused and surprised. He did not understand how his grandson understood everything so quickly and asked him. The main character replied that he saw a photo of his mother on the dresser, and in it she was holding a violin in her hands. The grandfather said that his daughter tried very hard during the recording, and even the teacher did not skimp on praise. Carl White was surprised that after listening to the record only once, his grandson could tell the difference between an amateur and a professional. He suggested Frank listen to another record, and a completely different melody began to play, which from the very first note enveloped him in the aroma of spring flowers. It was a perfect performance without a single mistake, and even in harmony with the piano, the violin does not sound awkward. The melody played sadly, as if the instruments were whispering words of love to each other. The grandfather asked how he liked the composition, to which the main character replied that the violinist was simply something, such a pure performance that there was nothing to say. Frank also noticed that this record had been listened to too many times, and the quality of the recording was gradually deteriorating. Grandfather didn't expect to hear this. He often listens to classical music, but he would never have noticed this. He wondered if the human ear was even capable of catching something like this. Carl White's subordinates entered the office, and one of them was his youngest son. They all greeted each other, and the chairman asked what they needed. Frank's uncle was surprised and asked what he was doing there, to which his father replied that Frank was going somewhere with him that evening. The uncle was completely perplexed by what he heard. He shouted out a question as to whether his father was serious about taking his nephew with him, and received the answer that this was not a joke at all. He was outraged, because this was not a place where they would take just anyone. And even his older brother would be out of luck, and he was the oldest man in the family after Carl. Frank's uncle began to convince his father that his youngest daughter had her eye on their company, although she had never met them after running away from home. Carl was furious and yelled at his son, saying that he was worthless and was using the company's name everywhere. The grandfather shamed him for tearing his throat in front of the child in this unworthy behavior, and our main character did not know what to do and continued to listen to the nonsense they were talking. At this moment, Carl noticed that there was another employee in the office and asked what business he had come for. It was the man in charge of the chemical materials development project, and grandfather suggested that he leave the office and discuss the matter in private. Again, the same man, whom Frank had seen somewhere before but could not remember where exactly. An hour later, the grandfather and his grandson were already sitting in the car, and Carl said that Frank saw something today that he shouldn't have seen. On top of everything else, he added that if the other guys were even a little bit like Frank, then his life would be a little more peaceful. The main character realized that a lot has changed compared to his past life. His grandfather tells him such words, although he is not even the eldest grandson. From the record, which was terribly worn, he decided that Carl White probably regretted the past. Carl's eldest son was also riding in the car to the banquet, and he once again reminded him of the right he had to be there. The uncle replied that he remembered everything perfectly well and took the request that he behave decently seriously, although it offended him. Frank was noticeably nervous. After all, he would be able to attend a meeting that he had previously only heard about from rumors. They entered a huge hall where there were several large tables, a fountain in the corner, and a long staircase with columns leading to the second floor. They were met by Chairman John Smith, who had hosted Frank and his grandfather the other day. Max Smith, director of Jahan Holding, approached them from across the room. Frank barely recognized him. Up close, he looked even younger. He had never seen his director bow to anyone in his previous life. A man appeared behind Chairman Smith and greeted him. No one even noticed how he snuck up. John Smith was clearly delighted to see him and called his grandfather over to introduce them. Our hero immediately remembered the man and was delighted. His eyes lit up, and the people around him did not understand what was happening here. The man was Lorenzo Conte, whom Frank had given a lift to the hotel the day before. He smiled affably, and they began a conversation in Italian. Frank addressed him by name, and Lorenzo was surprised that he remembered it, and they were glad to meet again so soon and unexpectedly. John Smith told Carl that he had done a good job of educating his grandson. The main character's pronunciation was even better than that of his grandchildren, who had studied abroad. The grandfather stood as if spellbound. The driver told him about it, but he could not even imagine that his grandson was so good. Here, Max Williams approached Lorenzo without him noticing. The Italian apologized for not noticing him. He was too happy to meet his benefactor. Grandpa asked Frank to hang out with his peers. The adults needed to talk a little, and our hero went to get the butler. The main character followed the man into another room and thought about the unexpected encounters of this evening. He wondered what Lorenzo was doing to have received an invitation to a banquet of representatives from South Korea's largest corporations. Here they arrived. It was a banquet hall within a banquet hall. Only here were the grandchildren of the most influential people in the country. The boys gathered in groups, some dancing, others playing cards. Frank decided that he would not make friends here. Suddenly his name was called. He turned around and saw Jessica, who was heading towards him, and coming up, said that she missed him. Chairman Smith has more than 10 grandchildren, but he took his granddaughter to the banquet, which meant not paternal inheritance, but natural selection. Frank thought about how his grandfather was starting to change his views too, and Jessica was constantly glaring at him. She asked him to teach her to play the violin. The main character did not understand why she needed it, because at least she had a good teacher. Jessica said she liked the current teacher, but in reality, he was the only one who could summon winter. Shortly before the banquet, John Smith asked the teacher to speak with his granddaughter at the meeting. He heard that the teacher played the keys well, so he asked her to accompany him on the piano. Jessica's teacher thought it would be a family celebration at most, but she saw all the people shown on TV in the room. At some point, Jessica disappeared unnoticed, and Frank returned to the hall with the adults. His grandfather invited him to sit at the table with him. Of course, they were sitting next to Chairman Smith's company. He was also Grandpa's friend. Carl asked him if he had made any friends. Grandpa said that one day he might need people from here, but you need to try to learn to distinguish between who you need and who needs you. Frank listened to his grandfather carefully, since he had decided to tell him this. Then perhaps White Chemical would go to him. An announcement was made on stage that there would be a performance before dinner, and Chairman Smith revealed that his granddaughter would be performing. At that moment, the main character realized why she left so suddenly. The host told everyone to greet Jessica with applause. The pianist was clearly not feeling well, and Frank was worried if she was okay. The melody started playing, and almost in the first second it captivated everyone sitting in the hall. This is a piece by Vivaldi that Frank played at her place. He was surprised how well she played. Jessica's skills are much better than last time, from the pose to the technique itself. In such a short time, she has grown so much in her acting. How many sleepless nights she rehearsed. The audience was delighted. Everyone praised the chairman's granddaughter and could not believe that this was just her hobby. Jessica went up to Frank and he said she did a great job and it was a beautiful performance. But at that moment, the girl handed him the violin and said that now it was his turn to perform. Carl White didn't understand what was going on. He asked Jessica what she was even talking about, to which she replied that Frank was a very good player. His grandfather asked him if he could play the violin, but Frank decided to pretend that he couldn't play rather than embarrass himself in front of everyone. Jessica didn't back down. She told everyone that he literally played better than her teacher, but he wasn't sure he could play the way he played for her. Carl White told him to do as he saw fit. The leaders of the business world were gathered here and Grandpa brought him to introduce him to them. Frank is not a professional, so he shouldn't expect too much from himself. He will definitely be fine. He picked up Jessica's violin and told his grandfather that he would play on stage, but he needed a pianist to accompany him. Behind the scenes, the teacher sat worried and was glad that it was finally over. She would never want to repeat such an experience. And suddenly they addressed her by name. The host came up and asked her to play another composition. She couldn't believe her ears. A minute ago, she was glad that it was all over, and now she had to experience this stress again. The host said he was told to tell her that she would be paid even more than the first time, and her eyes immediately lit up with confidence. Frank came up to them and introduced himself. He said that now he would be performing with the violin. Before he began, he asked the teacher to hold her breath before pressing the first key. He said that when she played the second part, she made a small mistake at the place where the melody changes. She thought no one would notice, but the child was able to hear less than a second of error. Frank reassured her and repeated again about holding her breath. The main character greeted everyone and introduced himself into the microphone, adding that he was not a professional, but asked for their attention and began his performance. Grandfather listened to his mother's sonata every day to ease his longing for her. He is ready to play if this tiny violin can console Grandfather's heart. His heart was beating madly, as if begging him to play. At such moments, he felt that it would inevitably change his life. Frank's playing made the guests feel as if they were in a spring garden. This wonderful performance warmed and filled the soul with light. The grandfather was enchanted. He was immersed in memories of his daughter and was incredibly proud of his grandson. It was not the Beethoven sonata whose melody was engraved in the teacher's head. It's as if she has a completely new arrangement, and this flawlessly placed violin part, without letting go, leads her along. The warm charm of spring, permeating the melody of the violin, for some reason gives an echo of deep sadness. This soulful performance was reminiscent of a meeting with a loved one, but the spring day, which seemed to last forever, suddenly ended. Frank lowered his violin, all excited, but the audience's reaction did not take long to arrive. Everyone immediately began to applaud. Jessica was the first to stand up and began to support her new friend, and all the other spectators followed her. Everyone applauded, standing up, and admired the amazing performance. Compliments were heard from all sides. Frank thanked everyone very much for listening to him, and his smile at that moment was very reminiscent of his mother's smile. The grandfather remembered his daughter's performance and how happy she was at that moment. He could not hold back his tears and gave in to his feelings. His grandson managed to awaken in him what he had kept inside for so long. After the speech, Frank approached the table, and Chairman Smith asked him in surprise if it was true that he had never studied violin. The grandfather, whose eyes were wet, called his grandson to him, took him by the hands, and thanked him. Frank didn't know what to say. Even in his past life, he was at a loss at moments like this. But it seemed words weren't needed here. They stood holding hands and looking into each other's eyes, filled with warmth and happiness. The next day, Carl, his eldest son, and Frank were gathered at the breakfast table, and his son asked him if he would take Frank with him anywhere that day. The uncle said that yesterday he noticed how difficult it was for his nephew. At his age, it is better to rest more at home and eat a lot. The main character barely restrained himself from such words. Then Carl White said that Frank was going to visit Chairman Smith that day and asked his son not to worry about him. They were both stunned by this news. The uncle asked why he needed to go there, but the grandfather said that the car had already arrived. The main character was riding in a car with the Smith family's driver and didn't understand what was going on. Maybe Jessica missed him and asked him to bring her. Frank got out of the car and was overcome with strange feelings. The house was quite scary. The door was opened by Max Smith and Jessica. She looked at him with burning eyes and asked him to come inside quickly. The protagonist thanked him for the invitation, but Max said that he should thank Frank for coming. Jessica begged him so much to take violin lessons with her over the holidays that if it weren't for Chairman White, Max wouldn't have known how to get out of it. Frank was surprised and asked if this meant that they would now learn to play together at their home, to which he received a positive answer. Jessica asked her new friend to teach her how to solve problems until the teacher arrived. Half an hour later, she decided there was a trace of an erased pencil on the notebook. She decided again and again until she found the answer. For an 11-year-old, this is an incredible amount of concentration, and she got all of her answers correct. He asked if it wasn't too difficult. It was a complex topic, and at her age, there was no need to understand it. Jessica replied that once you give up, everything will end, so hold on and never let go. Frank decided that this was a typical passion for education among the heirs of major corporations, but he enjoyed it. The main character added that it is not at all necessary to make her yours, even if she does not need it. He added that Chairman Smith knows that if he tries to own everything, there will be problems. Suddenly, unexpectedly for the guys, Chairman Smith entered the room and asked Frank what, in his opinion, John didn't need most. The main character got nervous. He thought about making a joke, but he realized that it wouldn't work, and said that the chairman had already gotten rid of everything that wasn't needed. John Smith watched him closely and was shocked by his thoughtful answer. He started to ask our hero another question, but at that moment someone entered the room and saved Frank. It was Jessica's violin teacher who came in to give a double lesson, and she walked into the room and said hello to everyone. Frank let out a calm breath and relaxed a little. Jessica was very happy to see the teacher, and the chairman was upset that he was interrupted. He told Frank that they would continue the conversation next time, wished him a good lesson, and left the room. The protagonist believes that Chairman Smith is one of those people who hides a blade behind a smile. He will crush anyone in whom he does not find an inner core. Frank wishes that his grandfather could at least partially follow his example. The teacher suggested starting the first joint lesson and handed out a notebook with notes. But at that moment, our hero confessed something to them. The teacher was furious. It turns out Frank can't read music. She thought it was impossible after hearing him play. Jessica couldn't believe it. She asked how he played the violin then, how he made the guests believe that they were in a spring garden. Frank said that he repeated the composition a couple of times, and he was able to play it so well that the teacher asked him to show her his palms. He showed her his hands, and she saw that they were absolutely clean. They were definitely hands that had never learned the violin, and he really was playing without knowing the notes. She began to wonder if she might be witnessing the birth of a genius who would leave his mark on the music world. Unexpectedly for everyone, a driver came for Frank and interrupted their lesson. He had to quickly get ready and get into the car. The driver picked up the boy and asked him to buckle up, and they quickly headed towards home. Chairman Smith was standing by the window, and his son Max came into his office and asked why Frank had left so suddenly. They discussed the boy. Max said that he was amazing, and talent is not something you already have. You need to find it yourself and appropriate it. Max added that Frank's extraordinary insight is not at all like that of an ordinary child. There is a sense of wisdom in him. Jessica burst into the room, all beaming and excited, and her father asked how their lesson had gone. She said Frank was insanely good. He was just a genius, and she wanted to play like him. The grandfather told his granddaughter that she was not at all stingy with praise and that she seemed to really like Frank. At the same time, the car stopped at the White's house, and the main character told the driver that he would go ahead. Frank entered the room and saw two women standing by the window. One of them was a housekeeper, and in the second, he immediately recognized the silhouette of a loved one. It was his mother. She turned around with a smile on her face and affectionately called our hero by name. Frank asked how she could come unannounced and why she didn't even call him. He would like to go out and meet her. The mother answered him that she herself did not know that she would arrive so suddenly. Her grandfather had sent a car for her early in the morning. Frank never thought that his grandfather would make such a decision. In his past life, he did not have time to meet her again before his own death. But this time, everything is different. Later, the three of them gathered in the living room, a group they had never seen in before, almost since Frank was born. Carl White asked his daughter if it was hard for her to travel so far, to which she replied that everything was fine and smiled sweetly. The main character's mother did not understand what could have happened that made her father invite her to his house and ask if everything was okay with him. Frank's grandfather replied that everything was fine and that he was still quite the man, and she breathed a sigh of relief. At that moment, the housekeeper came into the room and brought tea. Mom immediately noticed that it was her favorite ginger tea and thanked her. The maid replied that Frank's mother was the only one in the house who drank it, and she could not forget it. Carl White was struck by his daughter's hands, as if she had been holding a violin with those little hands just a couple of days ago. But time flies so quickly. He, succumbing to his memories with a slight sadness in his eyes, addressed his daughter by name and said that she had raised her son wonderfully. Carl added that Frank was very mature, even compared to her greedy, shameless brothers. He also noted that you can learn a lot about parents just by looking at their child, and told them to come together next time. He talked about her husband and wanted them to come visit him together. He had realized a lot during these years of separation. The daughter could not hold back her tears. She was so surprised and touched by these words, because in her past life, her father never recognized her husband as a member of his family. The emotional gap became so deep that they broke off their relationship, but now he admitted that he missed her very much. They hugged, the ice between them finally melted, and the daughter again felt her father's care and support. At the same time, at the Smiths' house, Jessica asked her father and grandfather in surprise why they hadn't gone to work today. They replied that they were expecting a guest whom she had already met, and at that very moment the butler came up and announced that the guest had already arrived. She recognized the man, but she didn't feel any delight. She wanted to see Frank more. And in the White's house, while his mother and grandfather were hugging, the main character heard the news that was shown on TV and went over to watch. The man the reporter was talking about on the news was the same guest who was already approaching Chairman John Smith's house. This is the foreigner whom Frank drove to the hotel and who sat next to him during the banquet. That evening, the main character was wondering what this man was doing, and then suddenly the news announced that the Crown Prince had come to visit the Republic of Korea. The chairman, the director, and Lorenzo Conte sat in John Smith's office and discussed how the hotel's reputation had grown thanks to the prince. Lorenzo politely declined and said that it was all thanks to the efforts of Jahan Holding, and he only dedicated his face. The eternal crown prince, Lorenzo Conte, originally had no right to the throne at all, but became an excellent replacement for the former prince. And when Lorenzo's visit to South Korea is covered by news outlets, the Jahan Holding Hotel always looms behind him. It is not even worth talking about the impact this has. It is an advertising effect that cannot be bought for any amount of money. Lorenzo asked John Smith if he could ask him for a favor. He began to remember the festive evening and wanted to know if there was a video of Frank's performance. The prince thought that they were filming that day, and the chairman responded that it wasn't particularly difficult to get a video and asked why Lorenzo needed it. Lorenzo Conte replied that one of his friends plays classical music and he would very much like to show him this performance. Spencer, a friend of the prince, directs one of the most famous orchestras in Cremona, the violin and music capital of Italy. He is unusually talented, sensitive, and emotional, which is typical of many creative individuals. Any false note on the instrument offends his sensitive hearing, and he becomes very irritated. This happened recently at one of his rehearsals. A young guy playing the French horn made a mistake. A disappointed Spencer asked his manager after the rehearsal if there were any decent horn players in Cremona. The young man, who was the assistant accompanist, did not hit a single note on the French horn. But Spencer's assistant did not try to calm him down. He said that the conductor was terrorizing everyone with his perfectionism. The manager said that he had not come here to give recommendations, but to report that Spencer had received a call, and he handed him the phone. The conductor was not in the mood to talk to anyone, but decided to call back anyway. He called back and asked what the call was about, and in response, he heard the friendly and cheerful voice of his friend Lorenzo. Spencer was unhappy that the prince was calling too late, but he told him that he was in Korea and he was calling on business. Lorenzo said he had found a remarkably gifted boy, like Spencer in his prime, but his friend said he didn't believe the boy was gifted. The prince told his friend that he would find a video of his performance and bring it. Spencer did not listen to the end and hung up. He gave the phone to his manager and decided that the prince had gone completely crazy with age. In his opinion, after Mozart, all talent died out. While the grandfather was talking with his daughter and grandson, his eldest daughter and 2 sons returned to the White House for dinner. As soon as they saw Frank's mother, Carl's other children's faces changed. His eldest daughter immediately started screaming what was going on here. The other children helped her put pressure on her younger sister. They bombarded her with questions about what she was doing there and whether she was ashamed to return. Frank's mother sat there upset with tear-stained eyes. She didn't want to see them because she knew that's how they would greet her. Carl White could not stand the insolence of his children. He banged his fist and told everyone to immediately shut up and sit down. He looked menacingly at his children and announced that he had something to tell them all. Father gathered them all together in the living room to talk about the future of White Chemical. He said that from today on, his youngest daughter, Monica, Frank's mother, will also take part in the management of the company. The other children reacted violently to their father's decision. They asked what he was talking about. What kind of company management was Monica? She didn't understand anything. The eldest son said that this was complete absurdity. He was letting someone who had never called him in decades make decisions. The son said he understood that his father was excited about the long-awaited meeting with his daughter, but asked him to think it over again. But Carl White responded decisively that when it came to business, it was not gender that mattered, but ability. And besides, none of his children had shown any results. Frank watched silently as it happened. Surprised, it was all very different from his past life. Grandfather chose not his uncle, who received the status of heir only on the basis of gender, but his mother, who was distinguished by her abilities. A month of Frank and Jessica's joint violin lessons had already passed. The main character really liked them. He had fun. He enjoyed it so much that he always wondered why he hadn't done it in his past life. The teacher couldn't understand how he managed to achieve such a delightful tone, and Jessica repeated every time that Frank really was a natural genius. His girlfriend asked her to play him again and again. The main character liked it, and he never refused her. The teacher believed that our hero had a talent that she could not even dream of. But instead of envy, she felt her heart skip a beat. It turns out that giving your all to teaching someone is such a wonderful thing. She really wants to see how he grows up. Jessica was upset and asked Frank if he was really coming home after the holidays and asked him not to leave. The teacher supported her student and said that she was very sorry that he would have to leave. A lot had changed since his last life. Frank told them that he was still thinking about whether to leave or not, and it was clear from their faces that there was no limit to their happiness. The next day, the protagonist went to work with his grandfather. Carl White asked if he was tired of constantly sitting in the office with the old man. Frank replied that he enjoyed spending so much time with his grandfather, and Carl said that it would be nice if Monica could stay a few more days. She said she was worried about her husband and left without giving a clear answer, and after that, as expected, her relatives went out of their way to please her father. Carla's eldest daughter always wanted to surprise her father with her culinary masterpieces, although she didn't even know what he liked. She tried to tidy up the kitchen, double-checked how the housekeeper cooked, and tasted everything before serving food to her father. Frank's uncle was also constantly by Carl's side. He stood up for his sister and also pressed on pity with the help of his daughter. He said that his daughter was crying and asking to go to her grandfather. She wanted to see him so much. But the paradox was that his daughter was a baby and couldn't even speak yet. Carl White was fed up with all this circus that was going on in his house. He asked his son directly what he was doing there. The father asked if his son knew what he had done, that he only had a place in the company thanks to Carl, but that was not enough for him. He hired a bunch of incompetent good-for-nothings to join the company, who only know how to lick his boots. The The father banged his fist on the chair and said that his son was a fool because he had raised him in the company of nothing but criminals. The son fell to his knees in front of his father and began to ask for forgiveness. He convinced him that he could fix everything, but his father told him not to even think about appearing in the company. Carl White sat in his office silently, tormented by thoughts and doubts that Monica might not agree to help him with the company. Frank understood his grandfather's feelings very well and saw how much he was worried about his mother. Apart from his youngest daughter, Carl White has no children he can confide in. The main character said that if it really doesn't work out, then you can consult with professionals. He tried to offer an alternative to his grandfather so that he would worry less. This option cheered up Carl, and he agreed with it. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. It was grandfather's advisor. He apologized for disturbing and entered the office. He came to clarify about the development of new materials. This man was very familiar to Frank, but he did not understand where he knew him from. He was definitely not imagining things. He had seen him in a past life. And Frank began to remember where that face was so familiar to him. As soon as the grandfather said the full name of his advisor, the protagonist immediately had an idea and remembered everything. This was a man who leaked new developments abroad, which caused the entire domestic business to suffer, starting with White Chemical. In the future, this incident was named after the traitor himself. But at that time, the appearance and name of the criminal were not announced to the public. Frank wouldn't have noticed it if he hadn't been involved in that investigation as a rookie prosecutor. This is the irony of fate. The main character was determined, and he will not allow his grandfather's company to go down in this life. Frank wondered how he could catch this freak who was so much like a cancer in the company. The grandfather looked at the reports and was upset. His grandson noticed this and asked what happened and if it was related to his uncle. Grandpa was stunned. Frank was already quite smart, and lately he had been watching him work. Of course, he felt the atmosphere in the company. Carl said that he didn't have much longer to live, and that anyone who claimed his inheritance had no idea what they were doing. He was worried about what would happen to the company when he was gone. But he told his grandson not to worry. He would take care of everything himself. The protagonist didn't know whether to just say that there was one traitorous bastard in the company. They might think that he had simply gone crazy, because how could a young guy know this? Frank decided to present this information as a metaphorical piece of advice and said that mold never grows in just one place. He compared it to a laundry, where clothes get moldy and the owner only cares about the outside, not realizing that mold can grow inside as well. Carl thought about it because his grandson was right. The rotten part could quickly consume everything else. Leave it for a short time and the whole thing would spoil. Grandfather didn't immediately understand why Frank was saying this, but then he wondered if this child really could see right through everything and everyone. At the same time, in the Italian city of Cremona, Spencer's assistant tells him that there is a growing demand for foreign artists in Asian countries. At this moment, unexpectedly for everyone, Lorenzo runs into the concert hall with a smile on his face. Spencer was shocked. Because the prince was supposed to be in Korea, Lorenzo replied that he really wanted to see him and show him something. He took a cassette out of his bag and said that it contained a performance by the guy he had recently talked about on the phone. His friend reacted aggressively to the tape and said that he did not want to be an eyesore with his useless nonsense. Lorenzo didn't give in. He thrust the tape into Spencer's hand and begged him not to judge until he heard it. The conductor was surprised by this. Usually the prince would have turned around and left as soon as he heard a refusal. But why was he so persistent now? He took the tape and said that he would listen to it just once, and after that he would not waste his time. A couple of minutes later, the three of them were already sitting in the office. The prince was very excited and confident that Spencer would appreciate Frank's performance. They turned on the tape and began to watch the performance. The main character didn't really stand out in appearance. They waited for the violin playing to begin. From the first notes, Frank captivated Spencer with his playing. The prince's friend could not believe what he was hearing. He couldn't take his eyes off Frank and listened attentively to the composition from beginning to end. His playing was simply unimaginable. He expected to hear anything but this mind-boggling performance. He smiled for the first time in a long time of rehearsals and performances. When the show was over, Lorenzo asked if the guy was really a genius and if Spencer liked what he just watched. Spencer simply asked where the guy was from and told his manager to immediately book tickets to Korea for their next show. Meanwhile, in Korea, early in the morning, Carl White went somewhere with his grandson. Frank did not know where they were taking him. They drove through the mountains. The scenery was picturesque, and when they arrived at their destination, they were met by an elderly man. Frank looked around and suddenly saw a monument. He realized that they had come to his grandmother's grave. Grandfather took a handkerchief out of his jacket, began to carefully wipe the monument, and greeted grandmother with a smile on his face. He wanted to tell his grandson the story of how they met and asked Frank to listen carefully. Carl White met his wife at about the same age that Frank is now. She looked after the White household, and when they grew older and decided to get married, their parents were categorically against it. Then Frank's grandfather and his beloved ran away from home and moved to the capital. Grandmother asked him if they would regret it, but Carl answered that he already had the whole world in his hand and he had nothing to regret. But now that Carl's wife is no longer by his side, many things in his life have gone wrong. They sat silently and looked at each other, and suddenly the grandfather asked his grandson if he liked music. Frank is confused. He wants with all his heart to help his grandfather with the business, but in his new life, music and he are as one. Playing the violin, he feels alive. After lunch, they were already at the White Chemical office. Today, as quite often lately, the employees made a mistake. Subordinates came to the chairman's office one after another with questions, and now it was the advisor's turn. He wanted to clarify something about the documents on the development of the new material. Meanwhile, Frank was thinking about how to expose him. The protagonist has been skipping violin lessons for the past few days to keep the situation under control, but he still can't figure out how to take down the bastard. He remembered what he and his grandfather had talked about in the morning. His grandfather had asked him for only one thing, that he would help if the company ever needed his help. The grandson responded to this request by saying that everything would be fine with White Chemical and that his grandfather should not worry about it. When the advisor left, Carl noticed that Frank was sitting there looking thoughtful and upset. He told his grandson that the mold had a rather pungent smell and that they would soon sterilize everything clean. The main character's mood noticeably changed and his eyes sparkled. It turns out that the grandfather understood everything about the advisor. Carl White had spent his entire life in the forefront of business circles, and it was foolish of Frank to rely solely on his past life experience. In the evening, he had a joint violin lesson with Jessica, and he was glad to return there after a break of several days. The teacher praised Jessica. Now she plays much better than last time, all thanks to diligent rehearsals. The teacher sat thoughtfully and in a bad mood. Frank noticed this and asked what was bothering her. Jessica was so engrossed in her game that she didn't even notice anything unusual in her teacher's behavior. But now she, too, became curious about what was going on. Their teacher said she was worried that her skills had not improved at all lately. The children were shocked. They couldn't even imagine that even such masters as their teacher were worried about this. Their teacher must be really good if she was trusted to teach the heiress of a famous corporation. Frank suddenly realized that he had never seen her play the violin, and Jessica supported him, since her teacher had played more often before. The main character's friend begged her teacher to play the violin, and she managed to achieve her goal. The teacher approached Frank with a request. She wanted him to comment on her game. He had been able to catch the mistake when she was playing the piano, so she was convinced that he would be the one to figure out what the problem was. She picked up the violin and began to play. The composition was performed without a single mistake. Jessica enjoyed the performance, and Frank listened attentively. As soon as the teacher finished, she immediately asked the main character how he liked her performance. Jessica shouted that it was flawless, but there was indeed something disappointing about the execution, even though there was nothing to fault at first glance. Suddenly, it dawned on Frank what the problem was, and he asked the teacher if she always thought one beat ahead in her head when she played. She replied that it was true, and that she did it that way so that there would not be a single mistake, especially in the part where the bow moved up and down. The main character said that the thing is that she tries too hard to play perfectly. Her desire to perform perfectly became a mistake in itself. When the technique of performance is perfected to the limit, the melody suffers destruction. Meanwhile, in Italy, a thoughtful Spencer sat in his office after another speech and asked his assistant if there were any natural talents in the world. His manager responded that he certainly thought there were musicians with different talents, but he thought talent was useless without effort and experience. But he thought so until he saw Frank perform. His performance was stuck in his head. Spencer replied that he used to think the same thing, but now he can't wait for the concert in Korea. At this point, the manager wondered who the mentor of the gifted young man was. If the child was so talented, everyone would want to make him their student. In a panic, the maestro rushed for his coat and quickly ran out of the office. He looked very worried. Spencer blamed himself for not being able to figure out that there were other people besides him who wanted to get the main character. The next day, Frank and his grandfather went to the golf club at the invitation of Chairman John Smith. It was a private golf club, closed to ordinary people. Even the chairman's son could not enter without permission. In his past life, Frank tried very hard to get into this club, but he failed, and now that it finally happened, he was very happy. Chairman Smith said he envied Frank's grandfather because he had a very sensible grandson and winked at Carl. He also added that Jessica's legs hurt and she stayed home, but she will definitely regret it when she finds out that the main character came to the club. And that's what happened. The chairman began talking about the video of Frank's speech, and John Smith said that it had reached the Japanese. The Japanese told Chairman Smith that Ms. Samantha wanted to meet the protagonist in person. Samantha, known by the nickname Queen of Strings, Empress of the music world, became famous far beyond the borders of Japan and became a maestro of world significance. Frank didn't know what the video was about, but he began to suspect that it had something to do with his violin playing. Carl White thought that white chemical needed to be inherited by someone sensible, but he himself would be very sorry if his grandson's talent were to go to waste. He decided to ask his grandson directly. Carl came up and asked Frank if he would like to study abroad. The main character answered seriously and decisively that he did not want to go anywhere. Then the grandfather asked him if he liked making music. Frank realizes that his grandfather cares for him in a way that he once couldn't care for his daughter Monica. But Carl White has just over 5 years to live, and our hero doesn't want to waste precious time studying abroad. Chairman Smith intervened in their conversation. He said that Mrs. Samantha was very famous, and Frank clearly did not know who she was. The main character replied that he didn't care how famous she was, and if she really wanted to meet him, then she should come herself. This answer made the grandfather and his friend laugh a lot. John Smith said that now it was clear why his granddaughter had such a crush on him. At that moment, a subordinate of Chairman Smith approached him and whispered something in his ear. It turned out that he had an unexpected guest who really wanted to meet Frank. Meanwhile, at Smith's house, Jessica greeted the guest and offered to wait in the living room until her grandfather returned. She decided to offer him a cookie and ask who he was, but in response, she heard unfamiliar words and did not understand anything. It was Spencer. He was speaking Italian. When he realized that the girl didn't know Italian, he took a photo out of his jacket and showed it to her. Frank was in the photograph, just as he, his grandfather, and John Smith entered the house. Jessica pointed her finger at him and told the foreigner that this was the one he was looking for. Frank did not understand what was happening and who this man was. Spencer, when he saw the boy he was looking for, immediately stood up and went to meet him. He extended his hand to Frank and said that he really wanted to meet him. But our hero still didn't understand anything and asked the man who he was. He apologized and said his name was Spencer and he was the conductor of the orchestra at the Cremona Philharmonic. He also added that when he saw the recording of Frank's performance, he immediately rushed to Korea. Without further ado, Spencer invited Frank to play in his orchestra, something the protagonist did not expect at all. The Italian said that at first he would be off staff and that he needed to develop the skill to become a permanent member, but later he would definitely take him into his team. The main character could not believe that they were going to make him a member of the symphony orchestra from Cremona, which represents all of Italy as a whole. Chairman Smith and Frank's grandfather couldn't believe their ears. It was a great honor to hear such a proposal from the chief conductor. Spencer said he really wanted to hear our character play the violin again and asked if it would be too much trouble for him to do so right now. Jessica only made out one word of what they were saying, but that was enough for her, and she ran for the violin. It was all so sudden, but the chief conductor of the Italian orchestra had come here for Frank's sake, and it would have been impolite to refuse. Meanwhile, in Japan today, the Queen of Strings Samantha gave a concert, as always, to a full house of spectators. After the performance, Ms. Samantha returned to the dressing room and asked her manager if anyone from Korea had called her. He said that no one had called. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. It was a young guy, Jack, who accompanied the lady during the performance. The guy considered her his idol since childhood, and collaborating with the Queen of Strings herself was the dream of his whole life. Samantha remembered that Jack was from Korea and asked if he knew any violinists from there, talented kids that she might like. He replied that South Korea is not very famous in the world of classical music, and he does not think that there are any young people who can surprise it. The manager asked Samantha if she was too worried about that child, and added that there was probably a similar prodigy in Japan. But the Queen of Strings looked down at the floor and sadly said that there were no such people here, and that guy seemed to be made of different stuff. All she knows about him is that he is the heir to a large company, and that he has never participated in an international competition. At the same time, in South Korea, Frank agrees to play for Spencer, but only once. He chose to perform one of Bach's 6 unaccompanied violin pieces, which Bach had composed while grieving for his dead wife. It is not just about understanding the musical aspect of a piece. It is about being mature enough to perform it and convey its message. The sound of the violin was majestic. as if Frank was being accompanied by an organ invisible to the eye, and grandfather and the other listeners were delighted. Carl White no longer knew what to do with him, but Chairman Smith told him that Frank was smart and could take care of himself, and that he should choose between music and company. When the protagonist finished his speech, he informed Spencer that he would not be able to accept his offer of freelance collaboration. Later, when the conductor was riding on the plane, he thought about what had happened. Spencer did not expect such an answer, but at the same time, he was not at all upset. In his opinion, the guy clearly realizes his uniqueness more than anyone else, so no one will be able to get him so easily. Spencer thought that the Earth had not seen a musical genius since Mozart, but Prince Lorenzo was right. Meanwhile, in Japan, the evening after the performance, Jack sat at the synthesizer and cried with anger at himself. He was overjoyed when he got the chance to perform with Ms. Samantha, thinking that he was finally honored to stand next to someone like her. But in the midst of his performance, Jack made a mistake. So tiny that the audience hardly noticed it, but the maestro did. With her smooth melody, she managed to cover up this flaw as if nothing had happened. But Jack blamed himself for the fact that his arrogance had spoiled her performance. The next day, Carla's eldest daughter asks the housekeeper if her father is in the office and learns that he and Frank flew to Japan early in the morning. The main character and his grandfather were already at the airport. Carl White asked his grandson if it was his first time flying and what impressions he had of the flight. Grandpa said with a smile on his face that it was not necessary to take off your shoes on the plane. Frank pretended that he did not know this, although he did it on purpose to amuse him. The main character did not understand why his grandfather suddenly suggested going to Japan. He suggested that he go to a certain place to eat. When they arrived, Grandpa asked him how he knew about this place. Frank replied that he had seen it in some magazine in a list of the most popular restaurants. In fact, the main character visited here every time he came to Tokyo. His grandfather got a call and he left for a couple of minutes. At the next table, Frank saw a guy who seemed to be playing the piano with his fingers. His passion for music apparently didn't subside even while he was eating. Frank couldn't resist and approached the guy. He said that he had a very skillful performance. Jack did not understand what the child wanted from him. The protagonist said that Jack was rehearsing Brahms' Violin Sonata No. 3. The boy didn't understand how the child recognized the song from one finger movement. He didn't believe that it was even possible. Frank said that the interpretation of the piece depends on the performer, but it is also not worth getting stuck in one role. He added that his desire for perfection does not allow him to show all the capabilities of his left hand, which is forced to perform only low tones. The protagonist told Jack that he should be better off playing live music, but he's playing something that died hundreds of years ago. Jack tried to understand the notes so as not to let his mistress down and not make mistakes. But Brahms' music seemed contradictory to him from the very beginning. Even then, he should have told the lady that this music had died hundreds of years ago, the same thing Frank had told him. Jack wanted to thank the child and tell him that he was incredibly talented. But when he looked around, he couldn't find him anywhere. After dinner, the grandfather decided to be honest with his grandson and admitted that he had reserved tickets for Samantha's concert the following day. When Frank refused to study abroad, his grandfather thought it would be nice to give his grandson at least that experience, for which Frank was very grateful. The main character was happy. He could not even imagine that he would ever listen to the performance of the Queen of Strings herself. Carl looked at his grandson and understood that his talent was not meant for the tiny stage. He wanted to give him everything that he could not give to his daughter. The next day at Opera City, Frank and his grandfather were sitting in the front row and the stage was very close. Our hero was delighted. The host announced that the concert was about to begin, and a few seconds later, the man Frank had spoken to yesterday at the ramen shop came out on stage. It was Maestro Jack Taylor. Samantha was announced next, looking as stunning as ever, in a shiny black dress with her famous violin in her hands. She glanced into the room and immediately recognized Frank among all the others. Samantha pointed her bow at the main character from the stage. Frank didn't understand what was happening, and the lady was glad that she had finally found him. The performance began, with the melody rising like a nightlight. It suddenly collapses in a thunderous storm, the piano astounding Frank. But the main character in this composition is the violin. It envelops the persistent piano, as if driven to the edge of a cliff, with a melody full of love and indulgence. Frank had been looking forward to hearing Mistress Samantha perform so much that he was absolutely thrilled when it happened. After the concert, my grandfather said that it was the first time he had seen someone play the violin like that. Suddenly, at this moment, a man appears and asks to give him a couple of minutes. It was Mrs. Samantha's manager. The grandfather and grandson asked what had happened, and the manager replied that the lady had expressed a desire to meet with them. At the same time, in the dressing room, Jack asked Samantha for forgiveness for making so many mistakes. It was so hard and embarrassing for him to admit it earlier. He said that his mistakes also affected her performance, so he offers her his sincere apologies. Samantha replied that they had played Brahms's Third Sonata today and his interpretation had been beautiful. Compared to what it was a couple of days ago, it was just night and day, so she told the poet that this was already enough for an apology. Jack admitted that in fact one guy helped him, but he doesn't know his name, which surprised the maestro. At that moment, the door to the dressing room opened. The manager brought Frank and his grandfather and told Samantha that these were the ones she wanted to see. Jack looked at the protagonist as if he had seen a ghost, and Frank still could not believe that the pianist he had met in the ramen shop was Jack Taylor himself. To Jack's left stood the lady. She extended her hand to Frank and said that she was pleased to meet him. She really wanted to see him. The main character was overcome by strange sensations. In his past life, by the time he became a fan of Samantha, she had already died. He extended his hand to her and said that he was very glad to meet them. It was a great honor for him. Samantha saw his smooth, beautiful hands and was amazed. However, she decided that it would be strange if it turned out that such a level of skill was achieved through effort alone. Frank's performance charmed her, and if it weren't for the concerts, she would have flown to Korea a long time ago, so she suggested that he arrange an exchange of experience. Jack Taylor realized that if Samantha wanted not to teach him, but to exchange experiences, then she already recognized this child as a worthy performer. Frank was surprised by this offer. Seeing doubt on the guy's face, Samantha asked him to play her violin once. Her instrument was something that any violinist would want. It was one of the best violins in the world. He picked it up but refused to play. A few days later, Jack Taylor was giving an interview in Korea and was asked to tell what it was like to collaborate with the maestro from Japan. Jack said it was a great honor, and he saw the experience more as a mentorship because Ms. Samantha is simply incomparable. The interviewer said that Ms. Samantha also thought highly of him, and she said that Jack had every chance of becoming a maestro in the world of Korean classical music. The young maestro, in turn, said that, in his opinion, Korean classical music will soon face serious changes. On his last day in Japan, Frank and his grandfather visited the hot springs. The main character was delighted and would like to visit there again someday. Frank asked his grandfather if he was taking good care of his health, and Carl White said that he would definitely be fine for another 10 years. Unexpectedly, he received a counter question. His grandfather asked why he didn't play the violin for Mrs. Samantha. Grandpa knows how good Frank is at music, but he still wonders why his grandson turned down Samantha's offer when he needs her the most right now. The protagonist didn't know that his grandfather cared so much, but he felt that if he had played on her then, he would never have been able to return home again. But he didn't tell his grandfather about this. He ignored the question and changed the subject. Upon returning to Korea, the first thing Frank and his grandfather did was visit Chairman Smith, and Jessica was the most excited about their arrival. The main character brought gifts from Japan. His girlfriend was very happy. She was flattered that he thought about her and bought souvenirs for her. Leaving their suitcases at the entrance, they went into the living room and sat down together at the table to drink high mountain tea. Frank let the tea steep, then savored its aroma and only then began to taste it. Jessica's grandfather, Chairman John Smith, took notice of this, and it turns out that the young man knows a thing or two about tea parties. Chairman Smith asked his son if there was any discussion about plant locations. Max replied that he would sort it out. The discussion was about the unspoken confrontation between the provinces for jobs, since all production is concentrated in the center of the country. Frank asked Max how the politicians were going to solve this problem, but all he learned in response was that the issue had been passed on to members of the regional administration. Chairman Smith interrupted their conversation and asked the protagonist what he would do if two hooligans wanted to take his things. Frank was not very keen to get involved in the political conversation and responded neutrally, saying that he would have pleased them differently. Later, the chairmen were left alone to play a game. John Smith told Carl that Frank was very similar to him. John asked his friend what he would do about his grandson's school. Carl White said he would go with him to Seoul when the holidays were over. John Smith kept telling his comrade to seriously consider Frank as his heir. The chairman also reminded Carl White of the promise he had to keep and smiled slyly. Frank brought an album of Maestro Samantha with her autograph for his violin teacher. She was over the moon and thanked him for a long time. The teacher asked him how he liked the maestro's live performance. The main character replied that she was truly the queen of strings, and that said it all. After all the discussions, they began to actually practice music, Jessica and Frank learning a new composition. The teacher admired how quickly Frank learned from the performance itself, right down to the musical notation, and not a single mistake. She herself sometimes even has to ask him for advice. Suddenly, the teacher came up with the idea of sending the main character to a competition. She asked if he wanted to take part in an international competition where they look at age and experience, but she was sure that a letter of recommendation would suffice. The level is high because the competition is worldwide, and the teacher insisted that it would be a valuable experience. But Frank said that he was not interested. The main character is sure that he can earn as much as he needs without competitions, so he doesn't care about the prize money either. Besides, he doesn't want to live like last time, chasing money and power for the sake of pacifying his own vanity. The teacher added that if he won the competition, he would be exempted from military service, and Frank immediately jumped up from what he heard. He served so long ago that he forgot about those times. In his past life, he was credited with serving as a military judge, but this time he will definitely have to join the army. He shouldn't expect any help from his family, and he wasn't ready to devote his precious youth in the miraculously given new life to the defense of the state. He suddenly changed his mind. Competition is important after all. It's a great chance to test your abilities. Frank believed in himself and decided that he could. Even if Beethoven himself suddenly came to life and came to the competition, the main character would not give him the victory. The chairmen were still playing. Frank's grandfather was lost in thought, and John Smith took the opportunity to make fun of him. Carl White asked him if he knew anything about violins. John thought for a moment and replied that violins could cost a fortune. Chairman Smith said that Ms. Samantha's violin was worth about $40,000 in the 60s. He added that the price has probably increased tenfold now, and it would be difficult to get one like that unless someone puts it up for auction. Carl White didn't expect it to be that expensive and jokingly suggested to his friend that they place bets on the next round. Near the Whites' porch, the son whom his father had kicked out of the company was kneeling in the rain, screaming under the windows and asking for another chance. Carl came out onto the porch, his eyes filled with only anger and contempt. He asked his son if he himself understood what he had done wrong. The son replied that he would improve, that the advisor would be punished, and that this would be a warning to the others. Frank's grandfather was furious at this answer. There were many more people involved in this matter than just one advisor. He called his son a blockhead and was disappointed in him once again. Carl said he didn't want to hear any more, turned around and went into the house, and his son continued to beg for another chance. The next day, Frank and his grandfather were sitting in the office. The main character was deep in his thoughts and thinking about the upcoming competition. Carl said that he had a task for his grandson. If he made his grandfather smile, he would give him something. At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and grandfather's advisor on the development of new materials entered the office. Frank's mood immediately changed. He was angry that the rats his uncle had brought were still working here. The guy who leaked all the developments overseas in his past life is still filing reports for Chemical White. Frank clearly decided that it was time to protect the company and remove this rat. He was almost certain that it was with this document that the dirty deeds were carried out. The protagonist asked his grandfather for the report so he could study it himself. He wouldn't let White Chemical go bankrupt a second time. Grandfather was wary. Frank was certainly smart, but he wasn't sure he could understand the report. The main character asked whether the provisions on the new materials had been written in by the advisor or not, as they were full of ambiguous wording. Frank explained that the strength of the agreement depended on the words used in it, and according to the council's wording, the new materials were not exclusive to the company. The decision in court will be made in accordance with the adopted provisions, and with such an agreement, it will be difficult to obtain legal protection. This meant that if the advisor sold the developments to other companies, White Chemical would not be able to hold him liable. Frank added that his grandfather's company does not have a legal team and would inevitably face such problems if it signed the agreement. Grandfather's advisor in his past life took advantage of the chaos of that era and sold the company's exclusive developments abroad. Carl White asked his grandson how he knew all this. He couldn't tell the truth, so he replied that he saw something similar on the news. He added that a couple of days ago they talked about a similar incident on TV, and judging by the grandfather's face, he didn't really believe it. But then Grandpa smiled and thanked him, knowing that he wouldn't hear the truth anyway. But Frank had helped him a lot. At this moment, the main character caught his grandfather smiling, and a couple of minutes ago they agreed on a gift, and now he can ask for whatever he wants. In the evening, Carl White returned home from work and was met by a butler with an umbrella, as it was raining heavily outside. Carl's youngest son was sitting near the house again, shouting that he would hang around here until he received forgiveness. His father told him to go inside. Frank, his uncle and grandfather sat silently at the dining room table, not knowing where to start a conversation. The housekeeper approached the son and offered to bring him a change of clothes, as he was soaking wet, but he rudely sent her away. While Frank and his grandfather were leaving, he probably had time to rest and change clothes, since he was wearing something different in the morning. Carl White looked at his son with a serious look and told him that he should forget about running the company. The son couldn't sit still. He stood up and shouted that he had only failed to keep an eye on his subordinates once and that his father was too harsh with him. Carl White asked his grandson to step outside for a few minutes to talk to his son alone, but Frank's uncle continued to argue that he was innocent. As soon as the main character left the dining room, the grandfather stood up from the table and slapped his son. Frank's uncle has no idea how much trouble the rats he raises are causing. Carl told his son that he did not understand the responsibility that came with power and shouted at him to get out of there. Frank stood behind the wall and heard everything, and considering the potential losses to the company, in his opinion, his uncle got off easy. The next day, at Chairman Smith's home, an assistant came to John's office to inform him that the auction would be held in New York. He showed the chairman the expected price. John Smith had assumed it would be expensive, but he had not thought it would be that expensive. John told his assistant that they simply had to win the bidding, because his future son-in-law was no slouch. In the next room at that moment, Frank's ears turned red, and he jokingly asked who was gossiping about him. The teacher played a new composition for the children and asked the main character how he liked her playing, whether it sounded good. She still showers him with questions. Such people are called talented workers. Frank said that her posture looked wrong. She did not expect to hear such a remark, because she has been playing the violin since childhood and no one told her about it. He said that her posture was so cardboard that it could be printed in textbooks, but this is the wrong approach. The teacher is so obsessed with proper posture that she doesn't notice how one shoulder is sagging. Frank asked her to play again and adjusted her hands a little. The teacher was afraid that in this position the violin would make strange sounds. She tried to play. The sound became deeper and the melody was much softer. She did not understand how this was possible. The protagonist said that most people have their own posture, but it is difficult to find it if you do not change your posture. The teacher couldn't believe her ears. She had been playing the violin all her life, but this was the first time she had heard of anything like this. Frank also decided to check with the international competition to see if a letter of recommendation from a foreigner would be acceptable for participation. He was referring to Spencer, the conductor from Cremona, who, by the way, had recently become softer towards his charges during rehearsals. The conductor's baton, which cut the air in time with the music, seemed so sharp that it could cut you, but the maestro behaved as if he were plush. The accompanist told the others that Spencer was waiting to connect with someone in Asia. Apparently, he had found someone there who could inspire him. During a break between rehearsals, Spencer's assistant entered his office with a letter. The conductor was very surprised. He had no one to send letters to, but then he saw the sender's address on the envelope and was happy because the Republic of Korea was indicated there. The events take place in the White's house. Frank found a beautiful, very elegant suit on the table in the living room. He went down to the dining room to ask his grandfather about the suit. Carl replied that there was a wedding of very important people today, and they had to go there. Grandpa said that the son of the head of Sunsong Holding was getting married. Frank choked on his juice at the news. Carl White asked his grandson what happened, but the protagonist said that he read about their upcoming wedding in the newspaper and was surprised that they were going there. Frank decided that, judging by the time, today's groom was the youngest of the company's heirs, who had become famous for his dissolute lifestyle. The main character saw him in his past life at the prosecutor's office. He almost never left their office and always brought them nothing but trouble. It was time to get ready and leave. Both dressed up Carl and his grandson went outside, but they were awaited near the house. Carl's eldest son was standing next to the porch. He was going to go to the wedding with his father and didn't know that Frank was going there. This made him angry. The protagonist's uncle decided to give his nephew some advice and told him to behave properly because there would be many adults at the event today. Frank laughed at this, wondering if his uncle even knew how his little brother was acting. Before Carl's eldest son had time to reach the car, his father gave the command to the driver to go. The car started moving and disappeared from the yard in a second. Frank's uncle was confused and shouted after it. The main character realized that the grandfather did not even invite his son with him. This situation raised his spirits. At the same time, in Japan, in the office of the Queen of Strings, a business meeting is taking place between Samantha and the editor-in-chief of one of the most famous magazines. Adam, the editor-in-chief of Gramophone magazine, was an admirer and old friend of Samantha's, and he was happy to fly so far away to meet her. He congratulated her on the release of her 30th album and said that he was confident that she would win the Gramophone Award. Samantha said he was biased, but Adam responded that their magazine was the most popular among musicians, and the editor-in-chief's one-sided view did not decide anything. He heard that she had left her position as a judge at an international competition and asked why she had done so since everyone was waiting for her. Samantha thinks her assessment will be unfair. She admitted that she has already fallen in love with the performance of one of the musicians. Adam knows every active violinist, but he didn't think that among the newcomers to the competition there was one whose melody could touch her soul. The Queen of Strings changed the subject and asked about the auction at which someone bought a Stradivarius. Her interlocutor expected that she would take part in the auction, since this violin had the same number as her instrument. Adam said that this time it was quickly bought by someone influential from Asia. He believes that the instrument reveals its true value only when played. She tried to calm her friend down and said that eventually this violin would definitely find a suitable owner, someone who could handle it. Meanwhile, two friendly families had already gathered in the temple for a wedding, at which there were many of those who had attended the banquet of the heirs. The ceremony took place in a cathedral, which Frank condemned because they were trying to pass off a marriage of convenience as true love. The bride and groom looked like a prince and princess. The ceremony was very beautiful. Jessica especially liked it. Later, they announced that there would now be a festive concert for the newlyweds. Frank could not believe his eyes. Jack Taylor, the maestro of Iron and Blood, approached the piano. When the formal part was over, the guests sat down at the table to celebrate. Jessica wanted to feed Frank with her fork and reached across the table towards him. Everyone except the main character was amused by her behavior. But suddenly the table began to discuss serious topics. John Smith talked to his son and suggested that he expand the company to other countries, not just the provincial regions of Korea. He was attracted to China, but not only because of cheap labor. In the future, this country will become dominant in the global semiconductor market. Chairman Smith was very popular at the event. Everyone wanted to say hello to him, as if it was his wedding that day. The newlyweds approached him to meet him and thank him for coming to the wedding. John Smith congratulated them and wished them a happy life. Jessica noticed something strange on her groom's neck and decided to ask Frank about it. The veins on his neck were clearly visible, and even behind the collar of his suit they could not be hidden. The main character guessed what it was from. It was a side effect of Viagra. Frank felt awkward because he didn't know how to tell his girlfriend. He changed the subject and suggested going for a walk. In another corner of the room, they met Jack Taylor, who was the first to approach them. Jessica was surprised by such an honor. Frank told the pianist that he didn't expect to meet him there. Jack tried to keep up the conversation and behaved very constrained and awkwardly. This awkward young man will later become a charismatic performer, but now it is rather difficult to see it in him. The main character said that he and his grandfather were delighted with Jack's performance. He did a great job. The pianist asked Frank if he noticed a mistake in his performance. Our hero was delighted with the playing, but he noticed the mistake. Even if you don't know anything about pianos, you can feel his level. But in this superb performance, his fingers seem to have become wooden. The main character noticed that the pianist didn't like this place. Jack Taylor would later be called the maestro of Iron and Blood. But one fact remains forgotten by everyone. Jack Taylor is one of the groom's relatives. Frank is not familiar with all the details, but thinks that they do not get along because of his difficult character and cold nature. Frank told Jack not to shackle the music himself. When people listen to his performance, they forget about all the ordinary things. The next day, the boys had a joint violin lesson, and the teacher was shocked that Frank had already received a letter of recommendation. The main character said that he himself was surprised that the letter arrived so quickly from other countries. He advised Jessica to change her hand position a little when playing the violin. She tried it, and the sound became completely different. The teacher asked who wrote the letter to him, because any letter wouldn't work. A recommendation from someone authoritative was needed. Frank smiled and decided not to name names yet, as it would sound too shocking for the teacher, and simply told her not to worry. At that moment, Chairman Smith's secretary entered the room and told the protagonist that Jessica's grandfather was calling him for a few words. John Smith apologized for pulling him out of class and offered him a seat, and later asked if Frank would be entering the competition. Jessica's grandfather challenged him to play the intellectual game of Paduk, and if Frank could beat him, he would give him something. Meanwhile, in the Italian city of Cremona, Spencer continued to enjoy rehearsals and enjoy the music. After the rehearsal, he suggested to his manager that they go out for a bite to eat, and he agreed. They discussed the international competition that had been moved to the fall, and Spencer thought that everything was turning out to favor Frank. His assistant noticed that after the trip to Korea, the maestro was in a good mood and had noticeably changed. Spencer asked the manager how he thought the world would change if the Italian violinist Paganini came back to life. Without waiting for an answer, the maestro himself said that the whole world would follow his magical melody with bated breath. Meanwhile, in the chairman's house, John Smith asks his comrade when he managed to teach his grandson to play Paduk. Carl White was drinking tea and almost choked. He heard for the first time that his 11-year-old grandson could play this very difficult board game. Chairman Smith said he not only can play, he plays much better than they might have guessed. He told Carl that the game was intense and he only won because of the change in the balance of power. He thinks Frank gave in to him. The main character's grandfather thought about it and decided to tell his friend what had recently happened to him. He told John about the project to develop new materials and that he couldn't figure out exactly what was wrong with it. But Frank understood everything right away. At the moment when he was saying how amazingly smart his grandson was, John Smith grabbed his hand and with a smile on his face shouted out that he was his matchmaker. Carl White asked him to control himself, but John responded by telling him not to forget the terms of the bet. Jessica's grandfather asked his secretary to call his granddaughter along with Frank and bring something. At this time, the children were practicing the violin, Jessica was playing, and the main character was thinking about what kind of gift the chairman was talking about. This was such an unexpected offer for him that at first he did not even think about what it was that he wanted to offer him. Jessica finished playing the new composition and asked her friend his opinion about her playing. As Frank was stroking her head and praising her, the chairman's secretary came into the room and said that Grandpa wanted to see them both. They entered the office, and the first thing the main character noticed was the case that was lying on the table in front of the grandfathers. As soon as he saw it, Frank's heart started pounding wildly. He didn't understand what was happening to him. Chairman Smith asked his secretary to open the case, and Frank saw a case of flame-red wood. He was fascinated by this violin and immediately recognized it. It was the Stradivarius Fantasy. The main character thought that he was dreaming. The masterpiece of instruments that had burned in a fire in a past life was now right before his eyes, and he really wanted to play it. Jessica told her grandfather that the violin was very beautiful and asked him who it was for. Chairman Smith said that he bought it as a gift for Frank. The protagonist could not believe that this violin was a gift for winning the paddock. John Smith added with a grin on his face that the boy unfortunately lost the bet. He said that, unfortunately, he would not be able to give the Stradivarius to the main character. At that moment, Frank's life seemed to lose all meaning. The chairman said that he would give him this violin to participate in the competition and asked if it was not a shame to borrow it only for a while. Frank didn't understand what he was talking about, and the chairman added that he might not just let him use the violin during the competition, but give it to him forever. He froze like a statue and couldn't believe his ears. This violin is every musician's dream. The main character doubted that the fantasy, from one glance at which his heart was ready to jump out of his chest, would be given to him for free. Frank had thoughts in his head that he should quickly tell the chairman that he needed this violin and get it at any cost. But he held back. He slammed the case shut and said that it was too valuable a gift and he could not accept it. But the protagonist added that it would be rude of him to reject the chairman's offer, so he would use it during the competition. The children went into the room, and John Smith told Carl that Frank's eyes lit up and he still refused the offer, and this is incredible endurance for his age. Carl White himself did not expect such a turn of events, and added that it was the first time he saw his grandson so fired up about something. The inspired Chairman Smith jumped up from his chair and began to shake his comrade's hand, once again calling him matchmaker. On a rainy day, Adam, editor-in-chief of Gramophone magazine, had a meeting in London with his colleague Sharon. She was unhappy that, because of his business trip to Japan, she had to single-handedly put the arrogant newcomers of their magazine in their place. He laughed, saying that they would become critics from God thanks to her, and added that she, as editor-in-chief, was not at all obliged to do this. Sharon told Adam new rumors that Spencer from Italy had written a letter of recommendation for someone. Adam was speechless and tensed up. The Italian maestro had never written letters of recommendation to anyone before. Spencer is a strict and proud maestro. He doesn't even have a single student, so to whom could he write this letter? But that was not all hearsay. The Queen of Strings, whom Adam admires so much, recommended the same man. This news even made him angry. Adam asked his colleague who was able to get recommendations from such outstanding maestros, but she did not want to talk, because in her opinion, these were just rumors. He looked into her eyes for a long time and showed with his whole appearance that the conversation would not end until he found out the name, and then she said that the guy's name was Frank Miller. Meanwhile, the main character was not himself at rehearsals. He looked sick. He also lost his appetite, and at the table he joked that he was simply stretching out his food because it was so delicious. For the past few days, He hasn't been able to get the image of that violin, the Stradivarius Fantasia, out of his head. He sometimes reproached himself for not taking it when it was given to him, but he knew that John Smith would not give such gifts for nothing. He knew the habits of businessmen and understood that the chairman definitely wanted something from him, and the first thing that came to his mind was Jessica. At that moment, the car stopped, and he and his grandfather headed into the restaurant. At the entrance, they were met by the administrator and escorted to a table. Frank was confused, because from afar he saw that someone was already sitting there, but when he came closer and recognized the people sitting there, he was speechless. These were his parents. The main character was pleasantly surprised and very happy about the long-awaited meeting. He ran towards them to hug them. He asked how they got there, and his mother replied that their grandfather invited them. Frank's father was very nervous because his father-in-law had not spoken to him before, but today he even hugged him and called him son-in-law. The main character didn't even have to think about his past life. He was very happy that his family was together again. They began to eat dinner, and Carl White told them not to be shy about asking for help. If they needed it, he would do everything in his power. The grandfather asked his son-in-law if he was by any chance interested in the chemical industry, since, given his education, this job would suit him. If the chemical industry in the future produces high value-added products, White Chemical will become the goose that lays golden eggs. Frank knew his father had to agree. He looked at him and mentally begged him to give a positive answer. The main character's dad said that it was very sudden and he needed to think it over, and Carl White added that he had one more thought. Frank stays to study in Seoul. His grandfather persuaded his parents and they gave permission for this. He told her about it during a violin lesson. Jessica threw herself at him with all her might in happiness, and they almost fell over. The teacher asked whether Frank had submitted an entry for the competition, and added that the organizers had already begun selecting candidates from among the thousands of participants. He didn't think there were so many participants. The teacher said that from those whose applications would be read, only 200 people would be chosen and their videos would be watched. The teacher said that he had no experience participating in other competitions, and it might be difficult for him to get into the selection based on recommendations alone. But in the meantime, in Brussels, they had already read his letters of recommendation and were shocked by their authors. The organizers noted that Frank was too young and had never participated in anything, and they couldn't get their heads around it. They decided to listen to his performance and then decide whether to allow him to participate in the qualifying round or not. The protagonist asked the teacher what would happen next if they liked his recording of the performance. She said that after watching 200 videos, only 60 candidates will be selected to perform at the competition in Brussels. And then, from these 60, a few more will be eliminated, and after another selection, only 12 people will remain. Jessica asked if the selection ended after that, and the teacher said that this was where the fun began. For 8 days, 12 selected violinists will live and train in a secluded mansion near Brussels. The teacher said that it would be shown on TV. Frank was not entirely happy with the idea of being filmed for the show. He said it all sounded too boring and like a training camp. The teacher added that he would be allowed to take a violin made by the hands of a great master, but he was only concerned about being exempted from military service. Jessica was in the clouds. She listened to every other word of what they were discussing, but when she heard the word violin, she immediately ran out of the room. Frank didn't immediately understand what had happened and where she had run off to, but when he realized everything and tried to stop her, it was already too late. She brought the Stradivarius, which her grandfather had recently bought, and handed it over to her friend. The teacher was surprised by the antique case and asked where the violin was from, and Frank froze in one place and tightly squeezed the violin with both hands. The doorbell rang at Chairman White's house, and the maid, leaving her washing dishes, ran to the gate to greet the guest. It was the postman. He asked how the maid was doing and then handed her a letter from abroad addressed to Frank Miller. Someone said that you can sell your soul to the devil just to hear the melody of a Stradivarius, and now it is in the hands of our hero. His heart feels like it's trying to jump out of his chest, but as soon as her body touches Frank's shoulder, the feeling subsides unusually quickly. The teacher listened attentively to her students playing, but could not understand whether it was Mozart or Beethoven. She had never heard such a melody. Without deciding what exactly he is going to play, he simply lets his hands move so as not to be completely absorbed by the instrument. He felt warmth from the instrument, and by concentrating for just a moment, one could drown in the melody of the violin. Frank realized that if he had only opened the case for the first time at a competition, he would have been so impressed that he would not have been able to play. Jessica and her teacher stood in complete amazement and asked the main character what melody he had just played. But he had no idea. It was a melody that only the violin itself knew. So beautiful that it gave you goosebumps. The next day, a conversation arose between the chairman in the garden, John Smith asking his comrade whether his grandson was going to Brussels. Carl White replied that it was, and John was impressed. He didn't think Frank would get through the pre-selection so easily. Jessica's grandfather said that musicians are like orchids. They also overcome many obstacles and difficulties in order to grow. But he added that Frank is not like that at all. He shines from different sides, like a brocade carp. Although he is a child, he is completely sensible and plays the violin with such passion. When Frank refused the violin, he immediately realized that money could not buy it, and again reached out to shake his comrade's hand, calling him matchmaker. Carl White said that he is not against Jessica at all, but their feelings must be mutual. He does not want to interfere with such things with his greed anymore. At that moment, John Smith's granddaughter ran into the garden. She greeted Frank's grandfather and asked how he was doing. That same evening, the main character was seen off to the airport by his grandfather and his parents. His mother was worried that he had forgotten nothing and double-checked everything several times. She was very worried and said that if his flight had not been moved back 2 weeks, she would have been better prepared. Frank also often thought about why he was expected before others. But then another person appeared in his thoughts, and he began to look around. He asked where Jessica was, and the grandfather couldn't help but joke that his grandson had hoped his girlfriend would come to see him off. Mom asked if he could handle it alone. Maybe she could fly with him, but he replied that everything was fine, especially since they would meet him at the airport. Frank picked up his suitcase, said goodbye to everyone, and headed to the check-in area. As soon as the adults were about to leave, they heard the screams and tears of a girl who was running towards them as fast as she could. It was Jessica. She fell in the middle of the waiting room and cried bitterly because she didn't have time to say goodbye to her friend. Meanwhile, there were already several people waiting to meet Frank at the Brussels airport. One of the greeters was a menacing man with a serious expression on his face. He was waiting impatiently for our hero to look at his impudent face. And at the Korean airport, there was still drama like from a movie. Carl White scolded his friend for not warning that Jessica would arrive. John said that she was stubborn at first, but then suddenly changed her mind. Then he turned to Frank's parents and greeted them. They exchanged a few words, and later he called his granddaughter to introduce her to them. Grandpa told Jessica that these were Frank's parents, and she immediately calmed down, realizing that this was her chance to score points with her future mother-in-law. She wiped away her tears, pulled herself together, and said that she greeted them warmly, calling them mother and father, which shocked Frank's parents. The plane landed in Brussels. The main character got out and was surprised that everyone around was talking about the competition and went to look for his greeter. He saw a girl holding a sign with his name on it and walked towards her, coming closer. He introduced himself. The girl said her name was Eva and wanted to introduce the second greeter, but before that she asked if Frank knew any other violinists. The man standing next to Eva looked at him angrily, and the main character replied that he knew a couple of musicians who were famous all over the world. The man said that Frank was a cheeky child. The main character was angered by this, and he deliberately loudly asked Eva what this old man was talking about. This musician was indeed the only one of the competition organizers who was irritated by our hero, but for some reason he decided to go and meet him. He told his colleagues that he wanted to see for himself what a brazen person Frank was, but at the same time, the other organizers wanted to get their hands on this child. Eva suggested taking a look at Mozart, a Belgian art center, to see the concert hall before the competition began. When they arrived and Frank walked inside, he was shocked by the scale. The hall was so majestic and antique, he asked if he would perform there. The unpleasant man asked why he was staring like that and said that if a violinist comes here, he must definitely play. What was so unclear about that? Frank replied that the decision had to be made by the one holding the bow, and the man replied that this was just an excuse for the weak. An argument broke out between them again, crossing all boundaries, and Eva didn't know how to stop it. Our hero was very angry that this boor followed him everywhere. He did not understand why the competition organizers hired such rude employees. The rest of the staff stood outside the doors in the corridor and watched Frank. They concluded that in life he looked even younger than in the video. They realized that a serious argument had started between their colleague and the child, and one of the organizers told the others to move aside so that he could sort it out. As he stood behind the others, while he was pushing his way toward the doors, someone tripped and pulled the others down with him. 3 men fell together on the floor in the corridor in front of the main character. Frank did not understand what happened, and his main question was who all these people were. The man who accompanied our hero from the airport told him that everyone had come to look at him. One of those who had fallen stood up and approached Frank, asking if he knew them, but he only thought to himself that he was not obliged to learn all the contest staff. Another man said he had seen a recording of his performance and asked how Frank managed to play Beethoven's violin sonata. The main character was getting angrier with each passing minute because the recording was intended exclusively for viewing by the judges, and there was clearly a leak here. He was told that a violinist who entered the concert hall was obliged to pick up a bow and play. He picked up the violin case and walked towards the performance hall with a serious face. At the same time, other musicians were heading there, who had come to the competition to fight in a musical battle for victory. One of the participants was informed that Maestro Spencer had written a letter of recommendation to a violinist from Asia. Sure, there are talented new guys who are getting attention, but this guy was offended that Spencer recommended someone else instead of him. In the preparation room, all the participants were restless and looking in one direction, namely Frank Miller. No one could believe that this boy was also participating in the competition. He was too small, and there were those who thought that he had entered this hall by mistake. Frank was focused on himself and tried to push away all unnecessary thoughts, but the looks from all sides were making him nervous. There are 24 participants initially. They are still young, but there is no doubt that many of them will end up on the final list. This will be a moral duel that combines complacency and restraint. Our hero has never felt anything like this in his life. The host came into their preparation room and announced the first hearing. The order of performances is random. Each participant must play the assigned composition. The host announced that the first to speak would be contestant number 37, Frank Miller. After his name was announced, everyone around began to whisper, as they were convinced that the Queen of Strings and Spencer had indeed recommended this boy. When Frank walked onto the stage, he remembered his interview at Jahan Holding, and he didn't hesitate for a second. Seeing the members of the jury, the protagonist was overcome with panic. These were all those whom he had recently met and behaved inappropriately in front of. He tried to reassure himself that if they were professionals, they would be able to put aside their grievances and focus on his performance. Frank was given permission to begin, and he began to play the assigned composition, as always, merging with the violin into one. The judges watched him with bated breath to hear every note he performed, as if he had hypnotized them. The main character finished his performance with relief. He realized that everything went well and he would now be released. But suddenly one of the judges spoke. One of the jury members, making a note on a sheet of paper, said that Frank imitated Brahms very well. Frank was stunned. He didn't know that the judges would comment on the performance. He had heard that here they often don't even listen to the end. But it was good that at least he hadn't heard any heavy sighs yet. The next man asked him how long he had been playing the violin. The guy hesitated and decided to answer the truth. He said that he had been studying properly for a little longer than a month. The jury was a little amused by this answer, but they understood that the boy was so talented that Mrs. Samantha and Spencer did not hide their admiration. The man who had argued with him the most decided to ask Frank one last question. He asked why he played the violin. At the same time, in South Korea, Carl White came to visit a friend, and an interesting conversation began between them. John Smith asked why his friend was so busy, to which Carl replied that he thought his grandson had chosen music. Of course, he will not interfere with his desire, but what will happen to the company? John Smith proposed to put his granddaughter at the head of White Chemical. Carl laughed, but John said seriously that the company could be run by more than a man, and that White's offspring had already suffered from his old-fashioned beliefs. Carl changed the subject, asking how Jessica was doing, and her grandfather said that if she knew that the violin had to be delivered to Frank the next day, she would probably start whining and want to go too. As always, Jessica heard the end of the conversation on time, and her eyes lit up with happiness when she heard that she had to go to her friends tomorrow. The next morning, the results of the first qualifying round were known. Frank sat outside and studied the list. He saw his name among those who had gone further, but this made him sad. He thought about the question he had been asked at the end of his speech. He compared himself to those guys who put in a lot of effort to play at the competition in Brussels, and he didn't put in nearly as much. But his heart also begins to dance, as if the violin were leading him every time he played. At that moment, opposite the bench where Frank is sitting, a blond guy crawls out of the bushes. Frank was scared, but immediately remembered the young man. He was quieter than the others yesterday, but did not take his eyes off our hero. The main character went inside, and that guy followed him. He asked how long he would follow him. The stranger asked where Frank was going, and upon learning that he was going to the hall to rehearse, asked to come and watch. Some performers forbid people to watch them train, but our hero is not one of the sensitive types and had nothing against his presence. The guy wanted to make sure that this boy was really worthy of Spencer's recommendation. The bow played a slow, quiet melody, as if the stranger were forced to wander in impenetrable, utter darkness. It takes the wisdom and experience of an adult to perform like this, but Frank handles the melody like a piece of cake, and he charms him with his playing. At that moment, the door opened and the sensual performance was interrupted. Eva entered the hall. She was surprised that William was sitting in the hall and listening to Frank play. The main character became worried and asked what business she had come for. She said that he had a visitor, or rather that they had come from television to interview him. The interviewer explained that previously filming only began closer to the last rounds, but this year the regulations changed. She begged him to give an interview and tell about his acquaintance with great musicians who wrote him letters of recommendation. As soon as he sat down on the chair opposite the journalist, Jessica burst into the room and quickly ran up to her friend. She hugged him. Her eyes showed all the feelings she had for our hero. Jessica was so happy about this meeting. Frank's mother noticed this and couldn't help but comment. She said out loud that Jessica really liked her son. While our hero was talking to his loved ones and asking them how they ended up there, the operator turned on the camera. This shoot started with a normal but happy picture of the performer's life, where everyone is smiling and hugging. Jessica, without the slightest embarrassment, wanted to feed Frank, even though she could barely hold her chopsticks. While the main character, his girlfriend and mother were having lunch, the filming continued, which made everyone feel awkward. Frank's mother was the most worried, and she quietly asked her son when they would stop filming them. Frank thought to himself that if he felt uncomfortable spending all day in front of a camera, he couldn't imagine how much more awkward his mother felt. He approached the reporter and asked how much longer he had to film. In response, she apologized for the inconvenience and said that his family looked very harmonious. She said that if no one objected, she would like to interview his mother and younger sister. Frank laughed that they mistook Jessica for his little sister. He approached his mother and girlfriend and said that if they didn't mind, they would like to interview them. He could refuse, but they both agreed. While Frank was amused by the fact that everyone would now think that it was normal in Korean culture to take such great care of an older brother, Mom decided to break the news. Monica told her son that Chairman John Smith had given the violin and said that his people had delivered the violin without letting anyone else have it. She asked how much the violin cost, but Frank evaded it by saying that it was only given to her for the duration of the competition and that he did not know the price, deciding that it was better not to tell his mother about its cost. After the interview, the main character went to the rehearsal room, where William had been playing for several hours in a row. He asked Frank, who was passing by, how long he had been playing the violin. The protagonist hesitantly replied that he had been playing it for about a month. He knew that it would be a blow to his interlocutor, but he did not want to lie. William was angry. He couldn't believe that the boy could play the violin so perfectly after only a month of training. He continued rehearsing, when suddenly his friend came into the room and said that William was exhausting himself, and the second round was coming soon. His nose was already bleeding, but he continued to play. His friend stopped him and asked what happened. Even at the Royal Conservatory, where the best are selected, William looked down on others from the heights of his talent. His friend didn't understand why he was so tense and kept saying that the end would soon come for him. There was hatred and bitterness in William's eyes. He clenched the sheet of music in his fist and said that he would never be second. Before the second stage began, Frank went to the waiting room and was surprised to find that he was given a separate room with only the interviewer and cameraman. In the second stage, the topic of the speech was free without restrictions on genres. Out of 24 people, only 12 will remain. The main character hasn't picked up the instrument yet, but his heart is already beating like clockwork, as if the violin itself is asking him to get it out as soon as possible. He spoke to her in his mind that he would help demonstrate her true worth and offered to make this performance worthy together. At this time in Japan, the Queen of Strings was talking to pianist Jack Taylor about violins. The young pianist asked the maestro if she remembered the Fantasia violin, at a time when many were interested in the Stradivarius, since the competition was in full swing. Fantasy is cold, like thickening darkness, and the euphoria that Samantha is currently experiencing is hot, like the scorching sun. These are the only violins with the same number left by Antonio Stradivari, and the conversation then turned to the auction where they were presented. Everyone thinks that Samantha was the one who took Euphoria decades ago at that auction. But no, she couldn't get it that day. An old gentleman took both instruments and later approached her and gave her the violin, telling her to create countless melodies with this instrument. The Queen of Strings still doesn't know who it was and doesn't remember his face, but she will remember the promise for the rest of her life. The man who bought the instruments told her that the Stradivarius violins would find their owners themselves, and for now he was just taking care of them. Jack Taylor asked her what would happen if the violin did not find its owner, and Samantha replied that it would then turn to ashes. In Brussels, on the second stage, It was the turn of number 37, our main hero, who came out on stage, proudly holding the fantasy in his hand. The jury members' jaws dropped in surprise. No one could believe what they were seeing in front of them. The main bore of the judges would never have thought that he would see this violin. The Queen Eliza competition was really worth waiting for, at least for this. Everyone wondered how this boy could have an imagination, but the jury members quickly came to their senses and allowed the performance to begin. According to legend, if someone who is unable to become the master of this violin touches the strings, he will lose the ability to see the world and hear the melody, and it will turn to dust. Frank began his speech, and the question hung in the air whether Fantasia had found its owner and turned into flame instead of ashes. It was a composition of myths, the 30th work, the Fountain of Arethusa, and everyone seemed to be covered by a wave. The tone was so pitiful that it sent shivers down the listeners' spines. A great despair from which there was no escape surrounded the nymph Arethusa. The nymph was saved only by God's blessing, and Frank was committed to passing it on through his game. The mercy of the goddess turns Arethusa into a source of water. The ending of the myth is tragic, but in the melody of the main character, one can hear love and blessing. No one had ever interpreted myths in this way. Alex, the head judge, said at the end that it was a superb performance. But he later added that he felt Frank still hadn't found the answer to his question of why he was making music. The next contestant was William. His performance was sharp, harsh, and very nervous, which all the jury members noticed. His performance has been compared to fireworks in a field. He has a wonderful sense of melody, but he is in too much of a hurry, as if he is locking himself in a place from which he cannot escape. The judges told him to remember that excessive emotion can kill a melody. Backstage, Frank admitted to himself that Alex had caught him red-handed. He had thought about his question a lot lately, but still hadn't found an answer. Having put the violin in its case and entered the waiting room, he came across a girl who was shaking with excitement. He asked if she was okay, and in response, he heard that everything was fine. She was just a little worried, although she looked almost at death's door. It was Anna number 40. She performed next, and the judges said it was a really bad performance. She was told that she had talent, but her body was so tense that the melody was simply doomed to become the same. After the performance, Frank returned to his usual surroundings, to his mother and his beloved girlfriend. As the contestants walked past them, looking upset, he wondered if he could make music with such a carefree attitude. Jessica asked her friend what was bothering him, and Frank was surprised that his mood was so obvious. She said that everything would be fine, and he was doing great at everything, so he would do great this time too. These words gave strength to our hero, and he decided that he had no need to rush. He would find his reason. After listening to all the contestants, the jury members gathered in the office to discuss the second qualifying round. They were disappointed with William, whose haste canceled out all the positives, and the same with Anna. She definitely had talent, but her nerves got in the way. They decided to first determine the best contestant of this round. Alex said that there was nothing to discuss here. The best was the impudent little Frank. He plays like Paganini back from the dead, and it would be a good thing if he could succeed at such an early age and not burn out too quickly. But many believe that he has no reason to pursue music, and if he can't control his emotions, his skills will deteriorate. But one of the judges noticed his face and said that if Frank didn't love the violin, his expression wouldn't be like that. When he performed, his face looked like the Queen of Strings' face, so they have nothing to worry about. The jury members unanimously decided that number 37, Frank Miller, would take first place in the second round. At that moment, Alex thought to himself that if this boy could find a reason to be a violinist, then the world of classical music would see a golden age. Ava came into Frank's room and announced that based on the results of the second round of the competition, he would move on. She said that information about the third round would be announced a little later and added that during the discussion, the one who took first place was chosen. Meanwhile, in the rehearsal room, William's manager came to him to tell him the results, but he already knew that Frank would be the first. William said that no one else was capable of doing this except Frank and asked the manager to leave so as not to be distracted and continue rehearsing. The assistant asked him to take a break at least today, but William said that then he would never be able to step on Frank's toes for the rest of his life. The protagonist was informed that he had won first place in the second round. He was very surprised that the decision was made unanimously and asked how often this happens. Ava replied that, as far as she knew, this was the first time in the history of the competition, and this shocked our hero even more. In the evening, all the contestants who made it to the third round were invited to the concert hall to be told what would happen next. Mark Ampere took to the stage to talk about living in the mansion where the contestants will spend the next 8 days. During this period, All contacts with the outside world will be prohibited, and an agreement will be made with the participants regarding this. They will also have a meeting with the conductor of the Belgian National Orchestra, which will be attended by the King of Belgium. Marc Ampere announced that the training camp would start in 2 days, and that the necessary preparations had to be completed by then. He also expressed his sincere congratulations to the participants and said that these 8 days would give them the best impressions. Frank is looking forward to performing with an orchestra, having only been able to play with piano accompaniment until now. He noticed the evil look staring at him, and he understood that it was because he was nameless and very young. He was put on the same level with them. Everyone except William, who has personally seen him play, is skeptical, but he is still raging and throwing. Unexpectedly for Frank, the first person to approach him was Charles, a young guy from China. In the past life of the protagonist, this violinist was called the Star of China. He became famous not only for his skill, but also for his volunteer musical activities. At that time, the Queen Eliza competition and the mansion seemed so far away to Frank, but only now did he realize that he was among the future great maestros. The cameraman can't help but capture the fateful meeting between the rising Chinese star and the Korean prodigy. Charles told Frank that he had heard a lot from his teacher, Maestro Dan Loon, but was still impressed by the talented newcomers. He said he would be happy to perform on stage with Frank after the competition, when suddenly the main character's name was heard from the other end of the corridor. Jessica was running towards them as fast as she could, shouting Frank's name so loudly that the whole building could hear, which confused both boys. Charles smiled at this situation and asked the main character if it was his bride running here. Frank was taken aback by this question. This was not the first time he had gotten into an awkward situation because of Jessica. Later, the interviewer asked the main character's mother a few questions about their family and her son's childhood. The girl thanked everyone for the interview and asked Frank how he was feeling after so many trials. In fact, he himself did not understand what he felt, but he responded with enthusiasm that he was looking forward to a new experience. The next day, there was a move into the mansion. The main character entered his new room and was amazed by the view from the window. It was very beautiful and picturesque. After checking in, all the contestants had to gather in the room with Marc Ampere. Frank was the last to arrive and took his place. It was the first day in the mansion. Marc wanted to tell how the work is organized here and introduce the participants to the rules of residence. But first, he suggested getting to know each other better and starting from the side where Charles was sitting. Charles Yan from China stood up first, introduced himself, and said that he played a piece by Brahms during the second round. Next was Eric, a tall, huge, red-haired guy who came from Northern Europe. After him, Daniel Brühl from the Berlin University of Music introduced himself, a seemingly quiet and friendly guy. The encounter brought back memories of Frank's first day at the Institute of Forensic Sciences, when, as now, everyone was so busy promoting themselves. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear his turn come, but then he stood up, introduced himself, said that he was 14 years old and that he was playing a play by Simonovsky. Eric, the healthiest guy present, noted that the main character was very short and looked no older than 10 years. Next to introduce herself was Anna. She is from Russia and studies at the Tchaikovsky Conservatory. Anna aroused our hero's curiosity. He remembered that she was the one who was most worried before the performance, but despite her anxiety, she made it to the next round. William's introduction was the one that most angered the main character. He only said that he was from Great Britain and spent the rest of the time glaring at Frank. After the introductions were over, Marc began to explain the rules of the mansion, which is completely off limits to outsiders. In addition to cleaning, you will also have to cook breakfast and dinner in turns, which strongly reminded our hero of boot camp. Marc said that there are cameras installed throughout the mansion that film their daily life and music lessons, which will later be aired. Finally, he said that he hoped the participants would be able to develop their musical talents and realize their dreams. Finally given some free time, Charles suggested that they all chat about something and get to know each other better. But one after another, the refusals followed. Everyone went off to rehearse or just spend time alone, and Charles was left alone with Frank. In the end, they are all competitors here, and it won't be easy to just become friends. It was the same at the Institute. After the first day, everyone started plotting against each other in order to eventually win. Eliza's competition did not bypass Italy, and Maestro Spencer closely followed the events. Entering his office, the manager asked the maestro what he was thinking about, and he replied that the boy was already in the mansion and preparing for the third round. They began to remember the times in the wonderful mansion, because both had been there. Spencer had even won the main prize at one time. Spencer remembered the legend of the god of music, who has endless melodies and lives in a mansion. The manager said that all violinists have known about the legend since ancient times. God should come to the musician at dawn, but at that moment he was interrupted. Spencer corrected his version. God will not approach with the blazing dawn, but will call the chosen one with his soothing melody. And then he told him what would happen to Frank if he became the chosen one.